The Mandalorians are, inarguably, one of the coolest factions in Star Wars. Since Boba Fett made his first appearance in the franchise's early days, the Mandalorians have had a pretty large cult following. This has become especially pronounced since the release of The Mandalorian, which is partly focused on the Mandalorians and their culture. The Mandalorian wasn't the first piece of Star Wars media to focus on the Mandalorians though, and today we're going to be diving deep into the wealth of Mandalorian stories we've been given over the decades. We'll be addressing the entirety of the Mandalorian's legends lore up to the rise of the Empire, discussing not only the complete pre-imperial history of the Mandalorians, but also their culture, technology, and ideology.
Attention, Sergeant on deck!
The tale of the Mandalorians begins long before the time of the Empire. It begins with a people called the Taungs, a species of grey-skinned humanoids distinguished by their sharp claws and bony forehead ridges. They were tough by nature and warriors by tradition, and their society was organized into clans led by chieftains chosen for being the greatest of the clan's warriors. The Taungs' homeworld, Notron, was chillier than most, orbiting a little further from its parent star than the average habitable planet. Nonetheless, it was suitable for sentient life, as the existence of the Taungs shows. But the Taungs weren't the only sentients to call Notron home. The planet had another indigenous sentient species who the Taungs called the Gel. At the time of our story, the Gel were organized into an alliance of 13 nations, which was ruled from a shared capital city, Great Gel. The Gel and the Taungs had a contentious relationship, and over the course of their shared history, they fought many wars with each other, even as they both advanced and developed sophisticated technology. The Taung clans honed their warrior techniques in great battles against the battalions of Gel, becoming fierce and highly skilled fighters. The story of the Mandalorians begins with the last of the Wars of Notron, an all-out battle for control of the entire planet. By that point in time, the Gels and Taungs had decided that Notron wasn't big enough for the two of them, and they each fought to drive the other either off-world or to extinction. The war was long and brutal, and the Taungs fought well. Even hundreds of thousands of years later, the names of their greatest generals lived on in legend. Olhak the Reaver, the Doom of Ulmara, Rexutu the Unconquerable. But the Gel were more numerous and more organized, and this gave them the advantage. The Taungs were forced to retreat until they had nowhere left to retreat to, and all they could do was rally what warriors they had left at one last great stronghold, a high place not far from Great Gel, determined that they would not be destroyed without a fight. And so our story starts there, 200,000 years before the rise of the Empire, with the last stand of the Taungs. The story of that day was recorded in the epic poem Da Wurda Verda, one of the galaxy's most well-known pieces of ancient literature. Consisting of 700 verses in 11 chapters written in the ancient language of Notron Cant, this poem had only been partially translated even by the time of the Empire. But the parts of the story that had been translated gripped the public's imagination, particularly the 9th chapter of the poem titled The Maker Comes to Unmake, widely considered Da Wurda Verda's climax. The Essential Guide to Warfare gives us the translated version of this chapter, which we'll now quote in full. And so upon his pyre burned the doom of Ulmara, and the warrior band stood as ragged as bandits, in zigzag lines of mourning. With the dawn, the flat-faced Gel would come, cackling and howling, oozing mirth and tricks, and find the shade of the doom departed and the Taungs unprotected. And so, with the dawn would our woe be revealed. Our once bright armaments would become stacked grave goods, trophies for Gel children. Our flesh would become smoke given to uncaring gods, and the sky would forget our names. With death upon him, Reksutu the Unconquerable prepared to be stripped of all by his enemy, but vowed that his honor would be the last to be torn away. And so the Unconquerable gathered his kinsmen and his oath-girdlings alike. They polished their fearsome helms that they might flash even in the weak sun of Notron. They rewrapped the hilts of their weapons and pounded straight the shafts, that they might slake their thirst in Jel Ichor a final time. Assembled, they ascended, in taut Taung lines, to the high place where the Reaver had staked his standard before it was cast down into the mire. They gazed out over the gathering places and walking ways of Great Jel, where they scaled peak and cradled valley, the line of lights ordering the night. They unfurled the Taung banner, reversed, a reckless thing snapping in the dark, awaiting Jel eyes. And they performed ceremonies of leave-taking, for now they had died to the world and must be remade among the stars. When the dawn came, the Jel awakened and saw the Taungs upon the high place and were afraid, for the morning light caught the glint of helms and weapons and created phantom warriors, made of dazzle and distance. But the cleverest of them were not deceived, and saw how few we were. And so they assembled without haste, merry in mockery, and prepared to march. And in the high place we awaited death. But then came a shaking of the ground, and the sun's wand of light was eclipsed by a bright and terrible fire that exploded from the rock. The patterns of Great Jel shivered and broke, and after this came darkness, as very air turned to black ash. The Jel fell on their faces in terror, and from the high place we ran in haste to meet them, and we were cloaked in shadow. The Maker had come to unmake, and the Taungs would be his instruments. On the day the Taungs believed they were fated to die, Great Jel was destroyed by a massive volcanic eruption which filled the air with clouds of ash. The Jel were afraid, but the Taungs were enheartened. Under cover of darkness, the Taungs attacked, and against all hope, they routed the battalions of Jel, allowing their people to live to fight another day. The ash clouds from the eruption darkened the skies of Notron for a full 2 years, and during that time, the Taungs beat the Jel back, dealing them defeat after defeat. The events of that day remade the Taungs. It not only gave them a second lease on life, but it also fundamentally transformed their identity. They believed that the eruption that had destroyed Great Jel was an act of divine intervention on their behalf, proof that the gods were on their side, that the Maker had chosen the Taungs to unmake on his behalf. From then on, the Taungs called themselves Darwerda, the warriors of the shadow, the anointed instruments of their gods. But the Taungs' resurgence didn't last. The Jel eventually recovered, and when they did, they again had the advantage in the war. And in the end, the Taungs were defeated, but not destroyed. The victory described in Darwerda bought them that, at least. Instead of extinction, the Taungs' fate was exile. At the end of the war, the Taungs fled Notron altogether, retreating to the stars where the Jel would not pursue them. They wandered the stars for thousands upon thousands of years, wandering from Notron in the core worlds all the way out to Rune in the Outer Rim, never staying in one place for long. In spite of this defeat, however, the Taungs persisted. They clung to their identity as the warriors of the shadow, and even as they left Notron behind, they remained resolute, resourceful, and undaunted. They became nomads, waging wars with many forgotten peoples over the course of their travels, becoming pragmatic and ruthless, yet loyal and honorable. And even as, over the course of hundreds of thousands of years, they left all other ties to their ancient homeworld behind them, the Taungs never forgot that fateful day on Notron when the gods had spared them from extinction and anointed them the warriors of the shadow. The Jel, meanwhile, settled all over Notron. Great Jel was rebuilt and greatly expanded, and Jel technology quickly advanced. The Jels eventually became one of the most widespread and powerful peoples in the galaxy, though by then nobody called them Gels anymore. Instead, they were known by their own name for themselves, humans. And just as humanity transformed after its victory over the Taungs, they transformed their homeworld in turn. Over the millennia, Notron was buried under layer upon layer of urban sprawl, and it too took on another name, Coruscant. After their exodus, most of Taung history is unknown, though based on the 3 known worlds they visited, their travels must have covered a huge portion of the galaxy. At one point, sometime after the founding of the Republic back in the core, the Taungs settled on the planet Rune all the way out in the Outer Rim, an unpleasant, tidally locked world hidden in a nigh impassable nebula that would later be named the Cloak of the Sith. But the Taungs didn't stay on Rune forever. About 7,000 years before the rise of the Empire, a great Taung chieftain arose. His name was Mandalore I, and he led his people on another exodus across the stars, seeking a better world to call their own. Mandalore I led his people across the stars until they came upon a jungle world with 2 moons. It was lush, full of life, and rich in natural resources, and the Taungs decided to call it home. This planet had no indigenous sentience. Rather, its ecosystem was dominated by ferocious, city-sized reptiles called mythosaurs, great monsters covered in tough scales with razor-sharp claws, teeth, and horns. The Taungs saw these ferocious beasts as worthy challenges to test the skill of their warriors, and at Mandalore's command, the Taung clans fought and slew the mythosaurs all over the planet, driving them to extinction and leaving their bones to bleach in the sun. Once the mythosaurs were dead, the Taungs claimed the planet for their own and then named it Manda'yam, but in Galactic Basic, the planet was known forever after as Mandalore. As they settled on this new world, the Taungs once more remade themselves. After the eradication of the mythosaurs, Mandalore I had taken the breastbone of one of the beasts and carved a ceremonial mask out of it, which would be the symbol of him and his heirs, the greatest of Taung warriors. From then onward, whoever wore that mask would be anointed Mandalore, the sole ruler of all the Taung clans, whom all Taung warriors were sworn to follow. Following the lead of Mandalore, the other Taungs began to wear masks as well, many made of an incredibly strong metal that they discovered on their new homeworld, which they named Beskar. And these masked Taungs, the heirs of the Shadow Warriors, took on a new name for themselves in honor of their leader. They became the Mando'a, the children of Mandalore, or, in Basic, the Mandalorians. They claim the sigil of the mythosaur skull as their symbol, in commemoration of the Great War in which they came into their own. The Mandalorians would not remain entirely Taung in nature. Indeed, the Mandalorians would outlive the Taungs as a species. But the culture, ideology, and practices of the Mandalorians began with those of the Taungs, and even after the Taungs were long gone, their culture endured through their Mandalorian heirs. Those Mandalorians of later years bore little resemblance to the followers of Mandalore I, however, even if there was cultural continuity between them. Not long after the conquest of Mandalore, Mandalore I died, and when he did, a new warrior laid claim to his mask and the title of Mandalore. This warrior proclaimed himself Mandalore the Conqueror, taking the name of his predecessor as well as his mask, a practice that would go on to become central to the Mandalorian way of life. Mandalore the Conqueror declared that one planet was not enough for the Mandalorians, especially not one that had already been conquered. The Mandalorians were warriors, after all, and warriors needed wars to fight. Mandalore believed that his people needed to seek out new enemies to conquer, new lands to claim in the name of their gods. Under him, the Mandalorians pushed out from their home system into the surrounding sector of space, beginning a series of holy wars known as the Mandalorian Crusades. This generation of Mandalorians, in turn, became known as the Mandalorian Crusaders. Before we begin the story of the Crusaders, however, we must first get a better grasp of the beliefs behind their crusades. the religion of the Mandalorians. The Taungs, as should be clear by this point, were a deeply religious people, and their religious beliefs and practices were carried over into Mandalorian culture. Indeed, Taung religion was the foundation of Mandalorian culture. As with all things Mandalorian, this religion changed dramatically over the course of the culture's history, but even the more secular, non-Taung generations of Mandalorians that were to come could trace every value they held dear back to the first Crusaders' religious precepts. The early Mandalorians believed in 3 chief gods. To the Mandalorians, the greatest of these was Kad Haranjir, the god of challenge, who represented change, growth, destruction, conflict, competition, and evolution. The Mandalorians believed that Kad Haranjir was locked in a constant war with another of their gods, Arasum, the god of sloth, who represented stagnation and idleness. The 2 gods were held to battle for control of each Mandalorian's soul. Kad Haranjir drove the Mandalorians to face challenges, fight battles, and hone their strength and skill, while Arasum tried to tempt the clans into resting on their laurels, giving into idleness and weakness. There was also a 3rd Mandalorian god about whom little is known, Hod Haran, the trickster who represented fortune. Kad Haranjir appears to have been the only god the Mandalorians actively worshipped, and it was on his behalf that the Mandalorian Crusades were fought. The early Mandalorians believed that conflict was the ultimate agent of change and growth, and that war, the highest form of conflict, was the most honorable way to serve Kad Haranjir and defy the temptations of Arasum. Thus, the Mandalorians waged endless war for thousands of years, taking every opportunity they could to prove themselves worthy of Kad Haranjir's blessing. As we'll discuss soon, most of these beliefs eventually faded out of Mandalorian culture. In fact, the Mandalorian Crusades actually lasted longer than belief in the god in whose name they had been started. But the ideological core of these beliefs was much longer lasting, and it was what defined the Mandalorians forever after. In many ways, the early Mandalorian religion was mostly a mythologization of a set of philosophical principles, ones the Taungs had embraced during their long years as star-faring nomads. These principles were the core of what it meant to be Mandalorian, and everything else we're going to discuss today ultimately ties back to them in one way or another. Mandalorian ideology saw everything through the lens of a dichotomy between action and inaction, change and stagnation, conflict and idleness, strength and weakness. While Mandalorians are often mischaracterized as being morally nuanced and ambiguous, as they don't fit neatly into common moral categories or the binary of the Force, in truth, they had an extremely black and white view of the universe, just organized along different lines that most beings are accustomed to. They honored everything they saw as causative, transformative, or otherwise conducive to their understanding of strength, and they reviled stagnation, idleness, and weakness. The Mandalorians believed that every moment of their lives should be spent trying to strengthen themselves or the clan in some way, and while they had the good sense to understand that you need regular and sufficient rest to be strong, they still had a pronounced workaholic streak. In conjunction with this, the Mandalorians also saw just about everything as a competition, a test to prove who was the strongest and most fit. This was a part of Mandalorian society from the very beginning, when the Taung Crusaders regularly carried out ritual battles with one another as a way of worshipping Kad Haranjir. Even after the Mandalorians became more secular, competition remained a key part of the Mandalorian ethos. Despite this, Mandalorian culture wasn't overwhelmingly hierarchical. Competition, especially among Mandalorians, was not usually for the sake of gaining material advantages over one's opponents, but for moving up in the hierarchy of honor. The Mandalorians also had a strong sense of community and family, and they understood the value of cooperation, at least to an extent. In summary, the Mandalorians were fundamentally tribal, cooperative within the group, competitive with other groups. Where the lines of the in-group and out-group were drawn varied depending on context. Much of this is pretty clearly rooted in the Taungs' nomad past. For hundreds of thousands of years, The Taungs roamed the stars, moving from one planet to another. Resources would always be scarce, enemies would always be numerous, and the Taungs would often have to fight to get what they needed to survive. It shouldn't be surprising that they came to value war when it was crucial to survival. They became so community-minded during the long periods they traveled alone through space, or that they hated idleness above all when their civilization was built on always moving in search of new resources. Of course, Mandalorian ideology took the lessons of this period and applied it to a rather different lifestyle. Whether they remained valuable is a matter of debate. There was also one final aspect of Mandalorian religion that we haven't touched yet, one that, unlike all the rest, didn't die out nearly as quickly. This was their unique set of beliefs about the afterlife, which the Mandalorians referred to as the Manda. This was the only overtly religious aspect of early Mandalorian tradition to survive the time of the Empire, though the Mandalorians of later generations understood the Manda differently, seeing it as a collective state of being rather than as a literal afterlife, as the first Mandalorians had. In the original myth, the Manda was an ethereal plane to which Mandalorian souls were taken after death. In later iterations, the Manda was the collective oversoul of the Mandalorian people, which the souls of fallen Mandalorians would become part of after death. Notably, the more modern version of the Manda shares a striking similarity to the Jedi concept of becoming one with the Force, though the source of this similarity is unknown. If you're perceptive, you'll have noticed that for both versions of the Manda, we specified that it was an afterlife for Mandalorian souls specifically. That was because the Mandalorians believed that an eternal soul was something that living beings had to gain, not something people were born with. Specifically, they believed that souls were gained by living according to the precepts of the Mandalorian honor codes. The Mandalorians saw all outsiders as soulless, and they branded Mandalorians who didn't follow the old traditions as Dar Manda, which is to say that they had lost their souls. To be Dar Manda was considered a fate worse than death in Mandalorian culture. The Mandalorians still held all of these beliefs about the soul by the time of the Empire. This understanding of the soul and the afterlife somewhat alienated the Mandalorians from others in the galaxy. Many who faced the Mandalorians on the battlefield thought of them as cruel butchers, and when confronted with this, the Mandalorians had a tendency to just dig themselves deeper into the hole by explaining that all they had done had been for the sake of honor in battle. Most beings were, understandably, absolutely disgusted by how the Mandalorians prioritized honor and challenge over the lives of innocents, but from the perspective of the Mandalorian religion, it made sense to them. Honor was what made you a whole person. They thought nothing of the billions slaughtered because they had no honor, they had no souls. And the Mandalorians respected those among their enemies who stood and fought because they believed that, in doing so, their enemies were gaining a degree of honor, personhood, even if they didn't recognize it themselves. It doesn't change how abhorrent the Mandalorians' depredations were, nor how obviously problematic the concept of Dar Manda is, but we'll save the judgment for another time. And with that, we've covered enough that you should have a solid grasp on the belief system of the Mandalorian Crusaders. We'll be coming back to Mandalorian culture and belief at several points later on, but for now, we shall return to the story of the Mandalorian Crusades. Under Mandalore the Conqueror, the Mandalorian clans took to the stars, seeking other worlds to conquer. They would continue on this campaign for thousands of years, claiming victory after victory in the name of Cad Harenjit. Many of these crusades were fought close to home in the sector surrounding Mandalore, where the Mandalorians established a set of core territories known to the outside galaxy as Mandalorian Space. But many of their crusades were waged far beyond the borders of this sector on distant worlds that the Mandalorians would either raze to the ground or claim as remote colonies to settle on. As a whole, the Crusaders' war effort was rather haphazard. In those days, the Mandalorians had no organization apart from the basic structures of their clans and their obedience to the reigning Mandalore. Sometimes, individual clans would go out and wage wars of their own, conquering planets to claim as clan worlds, while at other times, Mandalore would lead the clans as a whole into battle against enemies near and far. The Mandalorian Crusaders lacked a formal rank system. Instead, groups of warriors simply followed the lead of the most experienced among them, and units were ad hoc, organized based on the conditions of battle. They also lacked any semblance of bureaucracy or formal logistics. Warriors were expected to be self-sufficient, and the division of labor was generally informal. The direction of the Crusades would change with each new Mandalore, of whom there were many over the years. The tradition of the title of Mandalore, belonging to the wearer of Mandalore's mask, which had been started by Mandalore the Conqueror, continued. Any Mandalorian who was able to take up the mask and keep it would become the new Mandalore, regardless of their place in the hierarchy, and regardless of how the mask was found, whether it was taken from the previous Mandalorian battle, or simply found on the previous Mandalore's body when they were slain by the enemy. The title of Mandalore came with tremendous power and tremendous respect, and those Mandalorians strong enough to claim the title and keep it could not only dictate the tide of the Crusades, but also make changes to the structure of Mandalorian society. There was a price that came with the mask, however, which was that the reigning Mandalore was expected to, in a sense, become Mandalore. They were to abandon their old name and identity, and they were expected to emulate all the Mandalores before them, continuing and building upon their legacies. After Mandalore the Conqueror, we only know of one of the reigning Mandalores for the next 3,000 years or so. Mandalore the Binder, who rose from being the son of a simple rug merchant on a Mandalorian colony world to one of the most renowned leaders of the clans, about whom nothing else is known. The history of the Mandalorian Crusades as a whole is rather spotty, in fact. The Crusaders kept no written records, and many of the Crusaders' wars ended with their enemies being completely exterminated, their homeworlds pillaged, razed, and then either renamed or forgotten, their history and original inhabitants forever lost. It didn't help that, during this part of their history, the Mandalorians intermittently returned to their nomadic ways, though they always maintained at least a token presence on Mandalore and in Mandalorian Space. Though they always maintained at least a token presence on Mandalore and in Mandalorian Space, the vanguards of the clans were constantly on the move, and the reigning Mandalore would often lead them in settling on newly conquered worlds for years at a time. They would sometimes receive supplies and support from Mandalorian Space, but for the most part, the armies of the Crusaders were their own entity, a stateless army, always on campaign, never staying in one place for long. Entire generations of Mandalorian warriors lived and died without ever visiting Mandalorian Space. Despite these complications, we know enough of the Crusaders' conquests to establish a rudimentary timeline. The first known exploits of the Mandalorian Crusaders took place on the other worlds of the Mandalore system. Apart from Mandalore itself, there were two other habitable worlds in the Mandalore system: Kalevala, which orbited closer to the sun, and Mandalia, which orbited further away. Concordia, one of Mandalore's two moons, was also habitable. If Kalevala or Concordia had indigenous sentience before the Mandalorians claimed them, the Crusaders destroyed all trace of them. But Mandalia, at least, did have a sentient species of its own, the Mandalian Giants, a warrior race of large, heavily muscled, green-skinned humanoids whose strength famously rivaled that of the Wookiees. The Mandalorians fought against and defeated the Mandalian Giants in one of their first Crusades, but they were so impressed at the Mandalians' performance in battle that instead of wiping them out, the Mandalorians agreed to coexist with their planetary neighbors. The Mandalian Giants became the first, and for many years the only, allies of the Mandalorians, one of only a few groups of outsiders that the Crusaders had any respect for. Most of the Mandalorian Crusaders' other opponents weren't so lucky. The Giants were one of only two indigenous sentient species in the entirety of Mandalorian Space to be spared. Many other peoples were completely exterminated. Such was the fate of the Fenala, the victims of another of the Mandalorians' earliest Crusades. The Fenala were more powerful and advanced than any other opponent the Mandalorians or their Taung ancestors had ever faced. Their homeworld, Fenel, was rich in a number of valuable ores, including the metals needed to synthesize the lightsaber-resistant alloy frick, which the Fenelar were the first known inventors of. The Fenelar were isolationist and militarized, known for their fearsome-looking suits of frick-laden battle armor and their powerful spaceborne dreadnoughts, which at the time were some of the most advanced warships in the galaxy. The shipwrights and technologists of Fennel were unmatched, but when the Mandalorian Crusaders came knocking, they didn't stand a chance. By 6,700 years before the Battle of Yavin, the Fenelar had been completely exterminated, and the Mandalorians claimed their advanced technology for their own use. And Fenelar were only the first known people rather, to be subjected to such a fate at the hands of the Crusaders. Just a few centuries later, the Mandalorians waged war against a neighboring species, the Tlonians, a species of sentient arachnids. By 6100 BBY, the Tlonians too were completely exterminated, and their homeworld, Tlon, was incinerated by the Crusaders, rendered a scorched and uninhabitable rock. As time went on, however, the Mandalorians seem to have lowered their standards for sparing a species. When the Crusaders reached the Jakelia system, the Jakelians submitted to the Mandalorians and were taken as vassals. A few human colonies near Mandalore, among them Conquered Dawn and Gargan, were also vassalized instead of destroyed. In a battle with the Iskaloni, a race of ruthless cyborgs, the Crusaders killed all the Iskaloni they came across but freed their slaves, who were assimilated into Mandalorian society. Some of these vassals were even allowed to join the ranks of the Mandalorians. The Mandalorian Crusaders didn't actively recruit, though all Mandalorians were expected to raise their children as part of the clans, but they accepted any outsider who wished to become Mandalorian and was deemed worthy by one of the clans. The Taungs, at least by this point, didn't believe themselves superior to other species, rather they believed in the superiority of the Mandalorian ways, and members of other species who joined the clans were seen as equals. The Mandalorians' traditional battle armor helped in this process as, to an extent, it obscured the species of the wearer. By the end of the Mandalorian Crusades, the ranks of the Mandalorians were still overwhelmingly dominated by Taungs, but they also included Mandalorian giants, Jakelians, and even humans. The latter being an especially ironic inclusion given the ancient history between humanity and the Taungs. Speaking of humans, the Mandalorian Crusades eventually brought the Mandalorians into conflict with the Galactic Republic. The Republic was aware of the Mandalorians long before it made first contact with them. Rumors of terrifying armored raiders prowling the northern outer rim had stunted exploration in the region for years. But the Republic's policy toward the Mandalorians had been to avoid them, for the most part, which, for a time, spared Republic worlds from the Crusaders' wrath. But it had always only been a matter of time before the Mandalorians began raids into Republic space. The first of these that we know about was the Pathfinder Fury of 5451 BBY, in which the Crusaders attacked the inner rim world of Pathfinder before retreating back to the outer rim. This attack was followed a few centuries later by the Nakat incursions of the 5130s BBY, a series of skirmishes between the Crusaders and Republic forces on the edge of the inner rim. These early battles between the Mandalorians and the Republic were minor and ultimately inconclusive, but the Mandalorians learned much from them, and they adopted pieces of Republic technology after every campaign in Republic space. After the Nakat incursions, there are no records of Mandalorian history for the next 1,000 years, though that certainly doesn't mean the Mandalorians were sitting on their hands for all that time. Quite the contrary. They were conquering worlds, adapting new technology, and most importantly, they were beginning to undergo a series of important cultural transformations. The era of complex religious mythology and unwritten laws was coming to an end, and by the end of the late 4000s BBY, the decrees of one of the Mandalorians' greatest leaders would make these changes official, transforming the Mandalorians forever. But before we get into that, we're going to examine the worlds and technologies that the Mandalorians laid claim to during their crusades, which went on to define the territory and armament of the Mandalorians for millennia to come. Let's start with the Mandalorians' most prominent conquered worlds, the core systems of Mandalorian Space. Mandalorian Space wasn't a particularly large sector, nor was it a densely populated one. We only know of a scattering of systems there, as well as just one major hyperspace route, the aptly named Mandalorian Road, which originally connected Mandalore to the Republic world Coruscant. Parts of this route were later assimilated into the Hydian Way, and by the Imperial era, what remained of the Mandalorian Road just connected Mandalore to the Hydian. As we mentioned earlier, the Mandalore system contained 3 habitable planets, Mandalore, Kalevala, and Mandalia, as well as 1 habitable moon, Mandalore's moon, Concordia. None of these worlds had particularly large populations, owing to the Mandalorians' nomadic ways and the casualties incurred by endless wars, and even Mandalore itself was only home to a few million people by the time of the Empire. Of the habitable planets in the Mandalore system, Mandalia was reserved for the native Mandalian giants, while Kalevala, Concordia, and Mandalore were all home to Mandalorian settlements. Mandalore and Concordia were also home to extensive mines, as the 2 worlds were the galaxy's only known source of Beskar, Mandalorian iron, which we'll discuss in greater depth in the next section. For most of Mandalorian history, the settlements of the Mandalore system were all small and scattered across their respective planets, consisting of simple homes built around tapcafs and important industrial sites. Traditional Mandalorian homes, known as Veyam, were very simple and meant to be easy to disassemble and relocate, owing to the Mandalorians' nomadic origins. The Mandalorians did have some cities, but even their capital, the city of Keldabe on Mandalore, was small by the standards of most worlds. Its most prominent features were the Oyubat Tapkaf, a simple 3-story hotel and cantina that was built during the late Mandalorian Crusades, and the Mandal Motors Tower, a 100-meter tall skyscraper that was built much later. Outside of the Mandalore system, we know the names of roughly a dozen Mandalorian space worlds. Some of these were backwaters, such as the swamp moon Zanbar and the sparsely settled colony worlds Harswi, Hearthking, Sharav, and Draboon. Many others were clan worlds, the thrones of some of the Mandalorians' most powerful clans. The only one of these we know of is Ordo, a desert planet on the Mandalorian Road that belonged to the infamous Clan Ordo. There was Jakelia, home of the Jakelians, as we mentioned earlier, as well as the human colony of Gargan, which had a habitable jungle moon. Mandalorian Space contained 2 primary agri-worlds, Vorpiyar and Concord Dawn, the latter of which was probably the second most populous planet in Mandalorian Space, as well as one of its most historically significant. Lastly, we've got Breshik, the shipyard of the Mandalorian Crusaders. Beyond a doubt, Mandalorian Space contained more worlds than this, but these are all the names we're given by the lore. So that brings an end to today's astrography lesson, unfortunately. Now we're going to take a look at the other spoils of the Mandalorian Crusades, the technology that the Mandalorians adapted over the course of their campaigns. Contrary to what their lifestyles and organization, or lack thereof, might have suggested, the Mandalorian Crusaders were actually quite advanced. They had been from the beginning. While the Taungs' tales of their wars and ancient Notron suggest that they used Iron Age weaponry and equipment in their conflict with the Gel, many galactic historians believe this to be poetic license, as the Taung had to have had access to at least basic space travel technology by the war's end. By the time the Taungs came to Mandalore, they weren't too far behind most of the galaxy on the whole, even if their society took a form that might seem unbecoming of an advanced civilization. This is evident in their access to hyperdrive technology, as well as in the Mandalorians' most iconic invention, their Beskar armor. Beskar, or Mandalorian iron, was one of the toughest and most valuable metals in the galaxy. It was only found on Mandalore and its moon Concordia, and as you surely know, it was resistant to blaster bolts and even lightsaber strikes. But what you might not know is that the Mandalorians had ways of altering it during the forging process that made it even tougher. How exactly this worked is unknown. Mandalorian metalworkers guarded the secrets of Beskar forging jealously, and no outsider ever succeeded in properly forging Beskar without Mandalorian assistance. What is known is that the process involved adding carbons to the ore while it was being smelted, creating a molecular cage structure that made the finished product much lighter without reducing its durability. Beskar was discovered by the earliest Mandalorians during the conquest of Mandalore, and the Mandalorians' metalworking techniques were developed during the early period of the Crusades. These techniques endured for thousands of years, their intricacies a mystery to outsiders, consistently producing armor that was far superior to all others. The Mandalorians wore armor, which in Mando'a is Beskar'gam or iron skin, from the very beginning. Indeed, the early Crusaders' armor was one of the primary ways they were distinguished from their pre-Mandalorian Taung ancestors. But the armor of the Mandalorian Crusaders was quite different from the newer Mandalorian shock trooper armor you're likely most familiar with. Each set of Crusader armor was unique and highly personalized, mixing Beskar plates and more flexible pieces made of organic materials. The only feature that every Crusader's armor shared was the helmet. Back then, Mandalorian helmets were fairly low tech, with the only built-in electronic equipment being life support and communication systems. Crusader helmets were typically designed to evoke Taung facial features, making them much different from the rounded Mandalorian helmets of later generations, though they did have the distinctive T-visors that have since become the Mandalorians' unmistakable symbol. Most Crusaders wore fully sealed combat suits under their armor as a base. These suits could be pressurized to allow the Crusaders to operate in a vacuum, and most featured built-in oxygen reserves with 10 hours supply of air, which were connected to the Crusader's helmet by a set of breathing tubes. Mandalorian combat suits were pretty tough in their own right, and most were specially reinforced against melee weapons. Plates of Beskar were worn over the undersuit, the number and configuration of which varied from Crusader to Crusader. Generally speaking though, Crusader armor typically fell into one of two categories. The lighter configuration was sometimes called a heavy combat suit, as it featured just a few Beskar plates, typically a set of embraces, a set of greaves, a set of shoulder pauldrons, a cuirass, and a backplate. This armor provided considerable maneuverability, if imperfect protection, and as a result, it was preferred by Mandalorian scouts even after the time of the Crusaders ended. The heavier configuration of Crusader armor featured full-body Beskar plates, ideal for veteran warriors leading the charge in heated battles. Most Crusaders extensively decorated their armor, painting it with clan colors or symbols and grafting Beskar spikes all over some of their plates. While their Beskar armor was certainly their most iconic innovation, the Mandalorian Crusaders invented many other tools of war as well. They used Beskar to make weapons too, preferably melee weapons, as the Taungs believed that hand-to-hand combat was more honorable than ranged combat. Even in battle against enemies armed with blasters, the Mandalorian Crusaders would often close the distance to fight hand-to-hand, relying on their armor for protection against incoming blaster fire. The most popular of the ancient Mandalorian Crusader weapons was the Beskad, a one-handed, single-edged lightsaber. These blades were made of pure Beskar and were incredibly sharp and heavy. Their combined sharpness and weight allowed them to cleave bone. As a Beskar weapon, a Beskad could parry a lightsaber, allowing a Crusader wielding one to stand up to a Jedi in combat. Beskade were traditionally wielded in conjunction with a Kal, a small, flat-bladed Beskar dagger meant to be wielded in the offhand. The Mandalorian Crusaders also made use of a few polearms, which sometimes incorporated Beskar elements. One such weapon was the Beverajir, a traditional Mandalorian hunting spear, while another was the more exotic Mythosaur axe. The Mythosaur axe was mostly a ceremonial weapon, often wielded by the reigning Mandalore, but it was suitable for combat as well. The weapon consisted of a Beskar shaft crowned with a fan of blades made from calcified Mythosaur bones, which were surprisingly sharp. These gnarly weapons weren't the most practical choice for a Mandalorian Crusader, but they were certainly an effective weapon of terror. There was also the Besbev, a traditional Mandalorian flute made of Beskar that was sharpened at one end to be ideal for stabbing. It's unclear if this was somehow practical to the Mandalorian Crusaders, or if they just didn't like music critics. Of course, these weren't the only weapons in the Mandalorian arsenal. One of the greatest strengths of the Mandalorian Crusaders was their adaptability. In particular, their willingness to adopt alien technologies. In fact, the Crusaders used more alien weapons than they did Mandalorian ones, modifying technology they stole from their conquered foes to suit their needs. Alongside their traditional Beskar weapons, for example, the Crusaders were known to use Jekelian blades, as well as ranged weapons stolen from a variety of sources. The Mandalorians have always been a practical people, and even if the early Crusaders preferred melee weapons, they recognized the necessity of using ranged energy weapons as well. The Mandalorian Crusaders did have one variety of homegrown ranged weapon, the Mandalorian flash pistol, essentially a primitive blaster pistol. By 4000 BBY, they also had a large arsenal of pulse wave blasters of various configurations they had stolen from various Republic-affiliated groups, giving the Crusaders ranged firepower on par with the Republic military itself. Note that all of these were energy weapons. Contrary to popular myth, there's no evidence of the Mandalorian Crusaders ever using slug throwers of any kind. Apart from personal weapons, the Crusaders also made use of Republic rocket packs, famously used by the Republic's elite rocket jumpers, as well as fleets of Fenelar warships and swarms of Basilisk war droids. Now, we haven't talked about the acquisition of the Basilisk war droids yet, but we will very shortly, so we're going to do a breakdown of the droids now, while we're on the topic of Mandalorian equipment. Basilisk war droids, known as Bes'olik or Iron Beasts in Mando'a, were the most powerful weapons the Mandalorians ever had, and their use began toward the end of the Crusader period. They were six-legged armored behemoths, ranging in size from slightly larger than a bantha to larger than some small starfighters. Each Basilisk war droid was paired with a single Mandalorian rider whose armor would be locked into a saddle located just behind the droid's head. From head to tail, Basilisk war droids were packed with layer after layer of dense armor plating, making them extremely difficult to destroy or even disable. Basilisk war droids were semi-sentient, about as intelligent as most beasts of burden, and they developed strong emotional bonds with their riders. They could operate independently, but usually didn't, as they and their riders typically worked best as a team. Basilisk war droids were loyal and highly sentimental, known to howl as if in pain or fury when their riders were killed. In turn, they were cherished by their Mandalorian riders, who decorated their armor with clan symbols, Beskar plating for even greater durability, and the weapons of fallen foes. These droids could operate with equal effectiveness in space, in atmosphere, and on the ground. They were somewhat slow to maneuver, but they made up for this with sheer, unrivaled firepower. A Basilisk war droid was a walking apocalypse, armed with claws that could shred durasteel, banks of auto-firing laser cannons, pulse wave cannons, launchers for concussion missiles and shatter missiles, and, most importantly, a powerful shockwave generator which could generate an incredibly powerful plasma beam capable of pulverizing a starship. Basilisk war droids were essentially droid gunships, but some of the most powerful ever designed, capable of shrugging off a staggering amount of damage while simultaneously vaporizing entire villages. Typically, they were deployed from orbit onto target worlds by Mandalorian warships, paving the way for slower and less impressive troopships full of Crusader infantry. During a typical Basilisk war droid-led attack, Mandalorian warships would orbit low over planets, about 80 kilometers above the surface, and then deploy Basilisk war droids and their riders from drop bays. The droids and their riders would plummet down toward a planet's surface at incredible speeds, moving too fast for enemy weapons to track. The droid riders were protected during this descent by their Beskar armor and the magnetic tensor fields of the war droids. Just before they hit the ground, the droids would swerve up and immediately fire on enemy positions. Once they made groundfall, they would lead the charge, clearing the way for the lesser Mandalorians following behind them. All told, the Mandalorian Crusaders had an extensive and terrifying arsenal, one that allowed the clans to rival even the Republic itself. And indeed, all this arsenal was soon to see use against Republic worlds in the late 4000s BBY as the Mandalorian Crusaders entered a new age. It began with the rise of a new Mandalore, Mandalore the Indomitable. He took the title of Mandalore nearly 3,000 years after the start of the Mandalorian Crusades, and in his day, the Mandalorians were beginning to change. The old myths and rituals were fading out of importance, and the clans were growing restless, eager to face greater challenges. Mandalore the Indomitable felt this desire too. He had an innate drive to conquer, to wage war against the greatest enemies he could find. By the time he rose to power, the Indomitable was already a legendary warrior and a charismatic leader, a man who had the respect of his people and knew how to exert his influence. Ultimately, he would make extensive use of these traits, seizing upon the Mandalorians' growing uncertainty to usher in change. Early in his reign, Mandalore the Indomitable traveled to Shogun, a mysterious world with immense significance in the Mandalorian religion, a place where it was said that the Mandalore could receive visions from the Manda. Mandalore returned, claiming to have experienced just such a vision, which led to a momentous change in the Mandalorian religion. Under Mandalore the Indomitable, the Mandalorians abandoned the worship of the old gods altogether, for Mandalore's vision on Shogun had led him to the revelation that war itself was divine, holy in its own right, an end in itself rather than a means of worshipping Cad Haranjir. The Mandalorian Crusaders were reinvigorated by this shift, and Mandalore went on to lead them in their most daring crusade yet, a crusade into Republic space. This was not yet a crusade against the Republic itself, which was still too strong for the Mandalorians to beat. Rather, the Mandalorians' clans simply migrated into Republic territory, and by 4024 BBY, they had pushed all the way to the colonies. There, as a way of heralding the religious shift Mandalore had called for, they carried out the Nevuta extinction. Fought against the Nevuta, a species of dangerous sentient bees, the Nevuta extinction was a 3-year-long campaign of genocide. The Nevuta were no pushovers, and their leader, a warlord named Ithchakra, fought brutally in defense of his people, but the Mandalorian Crusaders prevailed, and by 4021 BBY, the Nevuta were no more. The Republic presumably tried to intervene against the Mandalorians, but there was only so much that they could do. Mandalore the Indomitable was effectively pursuing the stateless strategy, hiding his nomadic and self-sufficient army in the vastness of space between battles, and until he and his warriors attacked a target, there was nothing the Republic could do except try in vain to comb the star lanes. Thus, Mandalore was able to strike again in 4017 BBY, this time attacking the core world of Basilisk. This ancient world was home of the Basiliskans, species of large reptilians known as skilled inventors. When the Mandalorian Crusaders began their attack, the Basiliskans called for aid, and the Republic sent a great war fleet under the command of Jedi Master Sidrona Diath to the rescue. But not even Jedi intervention was enough to save Basilisk. The Mandalorian Crusaders were too numerous. They slew Master Diath, crushed the Republic fleet, and defeated the Basiliskans as well. Seeing that they were about to be overrun and likely wiped out or enslaved, the Basiliskans decided to poison their own homeworld with chemical weapons. By the time the Mandalorians emerged victorious, Basilisk was a barren, uninhabitable wasteland which Mandalore decided to abandon. But the Mandalorians nonetheless profited immensely from their victory. They took the surviving Basiliskans as slaves, stole a fleet of Basiliskan warships, and came into possession of the fearsome Basilisk war droids. Those Basiliskans who survived the death of their homeworld degenerated over the course of the next few centuries, becoming semi-sentient beasts the Mandalorians named Lagatos War Dragons. From Basilisk, Mandalore and his followers pushed into the deep core. As they did, Mandalore learned more about the layout and riches of Republic space, and he had set his eyes on a particularly tempting prize: the 7 worlds of the Empress Teta system, the Republic's great bastion in the deep core, located just down the Koros trunk line from Coruscant itself. But the Empress Teta system was well defended, so the Mandalorians didn't attack it immediately. Instead, their next target was the deep core planet Kuar, a human colony of little significance near the Empress Teta system. The Battle of Kuar took place in 4002 BBY, and as with previous conquests, it saw the Mandalorians all but wipe out the Kuarians. This was the first known battle in which the Mandalorian Crusaders attacked on Basilisk war droids, which no doubt contributed greatly to the utter destruction of the Kuarians. Once Kuar had fallen, Mandalore ordered the clans to establish camps in the ruins of the Kuarian cities, where the Mandalorians would remain for several years. Since Kuar was obscure and located in the hard-to-navigate deep core, it was a good place for the Mandalorians to lay low and bide their time, as the Republic was unlikely to discover their encampment there. Not that the Republic had the resources spare to attack the Mandalorians, mind you. At the time, the Republic and the Jedi were preoccupied with a slew of problems, most of them Sith in nature. In the years after the fall of Kuar, a joint Jedi-Republic campaign against Sith cultists on Onderon would indirectly lead to the rise of the Krath, another Sith cult that overthrew the rulers of the Empress Teta system and subjected the 7 worlds to a brutal reign of terror. Mandalore the Indomitable watched these events with great interest, believing that the growing chaos in the Republic would provide his warriors with the perfect opportunity for conquest. For 5 years, he and his warriors bided their time on Kuar, training in preparation for yet another great crusade. Then, in early 3996 BBY, Mandalore decided that the time had come. The Krath, whose military forces were now under the leadership of fallen Jedi and newly anointed Sith Lord Ulic Qel-Droma, had begun conquering neighboring systems, pushing forward into Republic space. From Mandalore's perspective, the Krath were rapidly overextending themselves, and the 7 worlds were now under-defended. The Krath had left the Mandalorians an opening, and the Mandalorians took it. The Mandalorians' campaign against the Empress Teta system was unlike all their previous crusades. Instead of trying to conquer the 7 worlds directly, the Mandalorians carried out a series of raids on Krath ships and carbonite smelter satellites, planning to bait the Krath into a direct, full-scale confrontation in which they could be destroyed in one go, rather than whittled down over the course of 7 long, costly conquests. Mandalore's strategy succeeded in baiting the Krath, but instead of ordering an attack, Ulic Qel-Droma contacted Mandalore directly, demanding he surrender. Mandalore retorted by challenging Qel-Droma to single combat at the plains of Harkul on Kuar for control of the 7 worlds. Qel-Droma agreed but added terms of his own. The victor of the duel would not only be granted control of the 7 worlds, but also the allegiance of the loser's armies. Mandalore and Qel-Droma met as planned on the plains of Harkul. By Mandalorian tradition, the warrior with the greater honor was allowed to choose the terms of honored duels, which, in this case, meant the terms were Mandalore's to decide. Wary of the threat posed by Qel-Droma's lightsaber and force abilities, neither of which the Mandalorians understood very well, Mandalore allowed himself use of his Basilisk war droid and arranged for the battle to take place on a network of chains suspended high above the plains, which he believed would even the odds. Nonetheless, when the battle began, Qel-Droma quickly slew Mandalore's war droid with his lightsaber, forcing the warlord to fight on foot. Mandalore challenged the Jedi to put down his lightsaber and fight with a mythosaur axe instead, and Qel-Droma did so. Despite all of Mandalore's attempts to even the odds, however, Ulic Qel-Droma ultimately defeated him. At the Sith Lord's mercy, Mandalore expected to be killed, but Qel-Droma decided to spare him, instead demanding the Mandalorians' allegiance. Mandalore submitted, pledging the Mandalorians to the service of the Sith, and Khal Drogo promptly ordered him to ready his troops for war. The Mandalorians would have a new crusade after all, one fought on a far larger scale than all the others combined. In the months that followed, the Mandalorian Crusaders would become one of a number of factions in the Brotherhood of the Sith, alongside the Krath, the Mokrosa Order, the Massassi, and the Sect of Dark Jedi. Under Dark Lords of the Sith, Exar Kun and Ulic Qel-Droma, these factions would go to war with the Republic and the Jedi. This war was known to history as the Great Sith War, but the Mandalorians remembered it as the Great Shadow Crusade, the last and greatest of the Mandalorian Crusades. Mandalore took his defeat at Khal Drogo's hands in stride, proving his loyalty and skill to the Sith Lord while maintaining his pride and honor. Khal Drogo made him the top general of his new combined Krath Mandalorian army, leaving most matters of strategy to Mandalore, who had more experience with such things. As Mandalore saw it, Khal Drogo was giving him and his warriors what they wanted anyway, a great crusade against the Republic, a glorious war of unprecedented scale. Most of the Mandalorian Crusaders saw things along the same lines. They were happy to go along with the Sith if it gave them the opportunity to earn honor in battle. A few Mandalorians, however, were displeased with this turn of events. They were dismayed that Mandalore had been defeated and objected to his alliance with the Sith, disgusted by the idea of the Mandalorians being ruled by outsiders. These objectors declared that Mandalore the Indomitable had lost the right to the title of Mandalore on Kuar, and that the Mandalorians were thus leaderless, as Ulic Qel-Droma, as an outsider, was unworthy to take the title of Mandalore for himself. These Mandalorians returned to Mandalorian Space, where they set out the Great Shadow Crusade. These objectors were a small minority though. Most of the Mandalorians had no problem with following the Sith, since Mandalore had ordered them to do so, and the Mandalorian honor codes dictated that the Mandalore be obeyed unquestioningly. Thus, the armies of the Mandalorian clans rallied in the deep core, forming the vanguard of Khal Drogo's Krath Armada. Under Khal Drogo and Mandalore, they began a series of raids on Republic armories and shipyards, stealing weapons, supplies, and warships, and leaving no survivors in their wake. The last and greatest of these attacks was against Fo'Rost, the location of one of the Republic Navy's most important shipyards, where a whole fleet of new, state-of-the-art warships was waiting in dry dock. Using Sith magic, the Krath witch Alima Keto hid a Krath Mandalorian invasion fleet within the illusion of a massive freighter coming into the shipyards for repairs. The ruse allowed the Krath fleet to get within the shipyard's defensive perimeter and attack, catching Republic forces at Fo'Rost completely by surprise. As Krath cruisers and Chaos fighters destroyed the Republic fleet above Fo'Rost, Mandalorian warriors attacked the shipyards, using jetpacks and Basilisk war droids to board the space station and lay waste to its defenses and security personnel. Republic forces were massacred, and once the Battle of Fo'Rost was won, Khal Drogo's followers seized over 300 newly built warships from the Fo'Rost dry docks, greatly expanding the Krath Armada. By the time Republic reinforcements arrived on the scene at Fo'Rost, the Mandalorians and Krath were long gone. All witnesses to the battle had been killed, and the shipyard's computers had all been burnt out. But Republic techs were able to salvage a snippet of holo recording from one of them, which revealed that Ulic Qel-Droma had been responsible, and that his next target was a Republic outpost at Kemplex 9. As soon as word of this got back to the Republic, a massive fleet was dispatched to Kemplex 9 in anticipation of the next attack. But the recording had been a ruse, deliberately planted by the Krath. Khal Drogo's next target was far more ambitious. He planned to attack Coruscant itself. Once the vanguard of the Republic Navy had left for Kemplex 9, Khal Drogo, Alima Keto, and Mandalore carried out an all-out assault on Coruscant, catching the galactic capital by surprise. Their fleet of stolen Republic ships smashed Coruscant's orbital defenses, allowing Krath attack ships to descend into the planet's lower atmosphere. Chaos fighters and Basilisk war droids rained from the sky, wreaking havoc across Galactic City. The main offense was centered around the government district, where Republic forces and a squad of Jedi found themselves severely outnumbered and outgunned. While his war droids assisted in the aerial battle, Mandalore led an army of his best warriors in the ground assault, backed up by phalanxes of Teton ground troops, Alimakito's Sith magic, and Keldroma's Jedi skills. Keldroma's main objective was the Republic Navy Command Center. Meanwhile, Mandalore stormed a nearby Republic arms depot where he hoped to steal new, state-of-the-art experimental weapons. Initially, the assault proceeded as planned. The Republic's defenders were overwhelmed by the suddenness and ferocity of the attack, and neither the Republic's soldiers nor the Jedi were prepared to battle Beskar-clad Mandalorian Crusaders. The Jedi ultimately proved more than a match for the Mandalorian warriors, despite their armor and skill, and the team of Jedi in the government district struck down Crusaders by the dozen over the course of the battle. But the Mandalorians had the advantage of numbers, and the rest of Coruscant's defenders were no match for them. Thanks to the Mandalorians, the Krath quickly achieved near complete control of the government district, allowing Mandalore to loot the weapons depot and Keldroma to storm the command center. There, the Sith Lord ordered the command center staff to order all Republic Navy fleet groups to make an immediate jump to a set of coordinates in the Vento system. If this plan had worked, it would have wiped out the Republic Navy in one blow, as all fleet groups were to be given the same set of coordinates. Fortunately for the Republic, Alimakito chose this moment to betray Ulic, helping to usurp control of the Krath-Mandalorian alliance. She ordered all Krath and Mandalorian forces to retreat at once, telling Mandalore that Keldroma had been killed and that the battle was lost. Mandalore begrudgingly told his warriors to loot what they could from the depot and then pull out, and before long, all Krath and Mandalorian forces had withdrawn from the Coruscant system, fleeing back to their holdings in the deep core. In doing so, they unknowingly abandoned Ulic Keldroma, who was captured by the Jedi. Mandalore was shaken by this loss, assuming that it had been due to an oversight on his part that Keldroma had been killed and the tide of battle turned. Alima assured him otherwise and suggested that he let the battle go, but the Mandalorian's honor demanded otherwise, and Mandalore couldn't get Coruscant out of his head. But before long, he learned the truth. Despite the Sith retreat, Republic forces had suffered severe casualties in the attack on Coruscant, and the battle struck fear into the hearts of Republic loyalists across the galaxy. Hoping to calm the turmoil and boost morale, the Senate decided to put Ulic Keldroma on trial for crimes against civilization. This had the unintended side effect of informing Mandalore that Keldroma was alive after all, following which he quickly figured out that Alima had betrayed him. Alima tried to convince Mandalore to leave Ulic to his fate and serve her instead, ordering him to rally the Mandalorians for an attack on Kemplex 9, for real this time. Mandalore prepared his warriors for the assault, but he then travelled to Yavin 4, the fortress of Exar Kun, Keldroma's Sith Master, to ask for help in breaking Ulic out of Republic custody. During the trial of Ulic Keldroma, Exar Kun, Mandalore, and their best warriors covertly landed on Coruscant and stormed the Senate building. As he froze the senators and their guards in place with the Force, Exar Kun freed Ulic, murdered the Supreme Chancellor of the Republic, and killed his former Jedi Master, following which he, Keldroma, Mandalore, and their warriors retreated back to Yavin 4. This attack sent shockwaves through the Republic, sowing panic across the galaxy, heralding the beginning of a new chapter of the war. By this point, Krath forces had begun attacking targets all over the Republic, and after Exar Kun's attack on the Senate, his Dark Jedi joined the fight, starting a civil war within the ranks of the Jedi Order. On Mandalore's command, the Mandalorians joined this offensive as well, beginning new crusades all over Republic space. Unlike in the early battles of the war, many of these new Mandalorian crusades were fought by the Mandalorians alone, while their Krath went on a campaign of their own. In most cases, neither the Krath nor the Mandalorians occupied the worlds they attacked, instead choosing to destroy, plunder, and then move on. In this manner, the Brotherhood of the Sith was able to cause a staggering amount of damage to the Republic in record time. Prior to this offensive, the Mandalorians briefly returned to Mandalorian Space, packing up their camp on Kuar and relocating to be closer to Exar-Kun's stronghold on Yavin 4. From there, the clans divided into two forces, one of them which cut across wild space in the Northern Territories to attack Republic frontier colonies, and the other of which attacked Republic space directly. The first campaign saw the Mandalorians advance from Mandalorian Space to Ithor, and from there to Ord Mantell, from which they carried out an all-out assault on Iridonia, a well-defended world which lay on the outskirts of the Republic's northern flank. The other offensive cut south through the expansion region toward the Slice, where the Krath had already left devastation in their wake. In the southern theatre, the Mandalorian Crusaders inflicted a series of grievous losses on Republic forces, winning battles at Alpharides, Thespias, and Contrum. But at Iridonia, the Mandalorians didn't fare nearly as well. They were crushed by a Republic task force, suffering heavy casualties in the process, and they were forced to retreat back to Mandalorian Space in disarray. This was just the first of many major Republic victories, a glimpse of the shape of things to come. Elsewhere, a small force of Mandalorian warriors accompanied the Sith Lords in sacking the Jedi homeworld of Ossus before its destruction, laying waste to the great Jedi library and many temples and settlements the Jedi had established on the planet. Kun and Keldroma had sent Mandalore and the vanguard of the Crusader army to attack Onderon, where they were to capture the city of Iziz in the name of the Sith Lords. Eager to test themselves against the vaunted defenses of the walled city, Mandalore personally led his warriors in the attack. The Mandalorians dropped from orbit on the backs of their Basilisk war droids, plunging toward Iziz like falling stars, while their war fleet waited in orbit to launch a wave of dropships. But the Mandalorians met fiercer resistance at Onderon than they had expected. For centuries, the people of Onderon had defended themselves from the annual assault of Drexel flying from Duxon, flying monsters that annually migrated from Onderon's jungle moon. Iziz was packed with air defense turbo lasers, and the city's recent alliance with the Beast Riders of the Onderon Wilderness amplified their defenses. The city dwellers and Beast Riders counterattacked together, and the Mandalorians found them to be tougher foes than any they had fought in this war. And the people of Onderon had reinforcements coming. Before long, a Republic fleet arrived, and the Mandalorians found themselves outnumbered. The Republic fleet destroyed the warships Mandalore had stationed in orbit, preventing the Crusaders from leaving the system. Several Republic ships then descended into Onderon's upper atmosphere, joining the Beast Riders and Defenders of Iziz in the battle with Mandalore and his Basilisk Riders. Outmatched, Mandalore was left with no choice but to order a retreat. The Mandalorians fell back to Duxon in disarray, and there, they immediately came under assault from the fearsome beasts of the Duxon jungle. Republic and Onderonian forces decided not to pursue the Mandalorians, and they didn't really need to. Many Mandalorians were ambushed, overwhelmed, and mauled by the jungle beasts. Among them was Mandalore the Indomitable. His Basilisk had been disabled during the retreat, and it had crashed on Duxon. Left without a mount and cut off from his warriors, Mandalore was alone when the beasts attacked, and he was quickly slain. So ended the Great Shadow Crusade and the Mandalorian Crusades as a whole. The Mandalorian Crusaders' defeat at the Battle of Onderon was devastating, and it forced the Mandalorians to pull out of the Great Sith War, retreating to Duxon and to Mandalorian Space. The war ended soon after with utter defeat of the Sith. Ulic Qel-Droma was captured, cut off from the Force, and eventually redeemed to the light, while Exar-Kun carried out a ritual on Yavin 4 that destroyed his body and wiped out the Massassi, leaving him as a disembodied spirit trapped in the ruins of his temple. The Republic and the Jedi were victorious, but this victory wouldn't last. Because, as the Mandalorians who had survived the landing on Duxon searched in vain for their fallen leader, one warrior stumbled upon Mandalore's mask. He claimed it for his own, and the title of Mandalore passed to him. He would be known to history as Mandalore the Ultimate, and under him, the Mandalorians would be transformed once more. Mandalore the Ultimate rallied the Mandalorian clans on Duxon, where they remained for years, secretly building a great fortress deep in the jungles on the far side of the Demon Moon. Other Mandalorians withdrew to Mandalorian Space, bringing hordes of stolen Republic technology with them. They had survived the Great Shadow Crusade, but the war had cost them dearly. Between their defeats at Coruscant, Iridonia, and Onderon, the Mandalorians had suffered greater casualties than they had experienced in any crusade up to that point, leaving the clans far too weak to pick up where they had left off before Ulic Qel-Droma had hijacked their campaign. The Taungs as a species had been greatly reduced in number, and they would never really recover. Troubled by the humiliating defeat his people had endured, Mandalore the Ultimate traveled to Shogun, where, according to legend, he experienced a vision. This vision confirmed a terrible truth. The time of the Taungs was coming to an end. Their crusades had whittled down their numbers to the point where their extinction had become all but inevitable. If the Mandalorians were to survive, they would have to transform once more. Thus, when Mandalore returned to Mandalorian Space, he announced two momentous changes to the Mandalorian doctrine. The first was that Mandalorians were to begin actively recruiting non-Taungs, assimilating as many beings into the clans as possible, while the second was that, going forward, the Mandalorians would have to be far better organized. No longer would they wander around the galaxy, pillaging worlds and then moving on. Going forward, the Mandalorians would set out to conquer, and they would make full use of the worlds they laid claim to. In summary, Mandalore wanted the Mandalorians to begin acting like a more conventional army. He wasn't the first Mandalorian to come up with that idea, however. After Mandalore the Indomitable's defeat at the hands of Ulic Qel-Droma, those who objected to Sith domination of the clans returned to Mandalore. There, they were steadily joined by veterans of the Great Shadow Crusade who had become critical of the Mandalorians' approach to the war. The Mandalorians were excellent at destroying their enemies, they reasoned, but inefficient at making good use of their conquests. They didn't recruit from the peoples they conquered, and they didn't make use of the industrial capacity of conquered worlds either. These Mandalorians ascribed these shortcomings to a lack of order and organization, and they formed small organizations they called the Neo-Crusaders, which sought to solve these issues by implementing a rigid chain of command, division of labor, and enforcing greater unit cohesion, largely by adopting uniform sets of armor. Most Mandalorians found the Neo-Crusaders odd, but a few of their leaders saw great value in the movement. One of them was a human by the name of Cassus Fett, a cunning warrior and gifted tactician. After Mandalore the Ultimate's ascension, Fett had become his chief strategist and aide-de-camp, and he brought the Neo-Crusader movement to Mandalore's attention. Fett saw that the goals of the Neo-Crusaders aligned with Mandalore's, and he believed that their approach to making a more organized and regimented Mandalorian society was the future. Mandalore agreed, and he began promoting the movement, tasking Cassus Fett with implementing the rank systems and uniform standards established by the Neo-Crusaders on a much larger scale. Cassus Fett wasn't the only Mandalorian Mandalore took as a close advisor, though he was the most visionary of the bunch, dreaming of a new Mandalorian order that would topple the Republic and rule the galaxy. There was also Dr. Demigol, a vicious butcher who carried out experiments on Jedi in the hopes of uncovering the nature of their powers, and the Mandalorian general Pulsifer, Demigol's former aide, as well as many unnamed others. But Mandalore himself remained in firm control of the changes being made to the Mandalorian ways, and even as he accepted counsel from Fett and others, his decisions were always his own. He began his reign with a recruitment campaign. The populations that the Mandalorian Crusaders had taken as vassals were offered the opportunity to become full-fledged Mandalorian warriors, and millions of them jumped at the chance, rapidly replenishing the ranks of the Mandalorians. As the clans began to push beyond the boundaries of Mandalorian space once more, their numbers swelled even further, as beings from all over wild space joined the cause. In just a few years, the ranks of the Mandalorians went from mostly consisting of Taungs to being an eclectic mix of Taungs, humans, Jaquelians, Mandalorian giants, Togruta, Elomin, Hrakians, Argirians, Thalassians, Tishar, Nalroni, Fofihians, Drakmarians, and more. Those who proved themselves as warriors and learned Mando'a and the principles of Mandalorian culture became full-fledged Mandalorians. Others were allowed to support the cause as farmers, manufacturers, and artisans, while those deemed to be without honor became slaves, put to work in the war forges of Mandalorian Space. Recruits were sent to Mandalore's fortress on Duxon, where they received training from veteran warriors and could prove themselves by battling the beasts in the jungles. Mandalore believed that Mandalorians should have a rapport with Duxon. On the Demon Moon, all life was gripped in a constant war for survival. It was, as Mandalore saw it, an excellent example of what the Mandalorians believed life was really about. Over the course of the next 20 years, the Neo-Crusader movement all but took over Mandalorian society with Mandalore's blessing. All new recruits were indoctrinated under the Neo-Crusaders. Some veteran Mandalorians rejected the movement and continued to cling to the traditions of the Crusaders, and Mandalore allowed them to do so, but as time went on, they became a rapidly shrinking minority, and during the next war, they would be eclipsed altogether by their more efficient successors. As the Neo-Crusaders became predominant, Casus Fett reworked their ranking system to better suit the new army. Going forward, the Mandalorians had 3 basic ranks: Warrior, Rally Master, and Field Marshal. The rank of Warrior was the basic one, assigned to recruits and rank-and-file soldiers, and it came with no command authority, though in the absence of higher-ranking Mandalorians, the warrior with the most experience was expected to take charge. Rally Masters were the officers of the Mandalorian war machine, acting as drill sergeants, field commanders, and cultural indoctrinators. The rank of Rally Master was initially earned by impressing a field marshal, and those with the rank typically commanded a large portion of their clan's army. Rally Masters were expected to keep the people under their command organized and to lead the charge in battle, and as the Mandalorians began bringing in increasing numbers of recruits, Rally Masters were assigned to teach them Mandalorian combat techniques, how to speak Mando'a, and the precepts of Mandalorian culture. Lastly, Field Marshals were the highest ranking Mandalorians during the Neo-Crusader period, apart from Mandalore himself. Originally, the rank was reserved for clan chieftains and Mandalore's advisors, and as such, it was highly coveted, a symbol of great respect. Field Marshals commanded whole armies, and they were considered the very best of the Mandalorians. As the Neo-Crusader period went on, however, the quality of the upper ranks of the Mandalorian war machine degraded. Mandalore began issuing the rank of Field Marshal first to the members of his vanguard, and then to older rally masters that wished to differentiate themselves from newer officers. Mandalore fell to resolving disputes between high-ranking Mandalorians by offering promotions to Field Marshals, and the quality of Field Marshals rapidly declined. By the end of the Mandalorian Wars, the rank of Field Marshal had become much more common, and it wasn't uncommon to see newly promoted Field Marshals commanding their armies from the cover of a bunker instead of leading from the front. Things got to the point where Casus Fett requested that he and the original Field Marshals be given a new rank to differentiate themselves. As the rank of Field Marshal declined, so did the rank of Rally Master. Rally Master's commands were steadily taken over by the Field Marshals, and the quality of warriors promoted to Rally Master declined rapidly, to the point that, by the end of the war, the rank was given out to any warrior that was fluent in Mando'a and knew the Resol'nare. Mandalore's other major initiative was establishing an industrial base for his armies, which the industry of conquered worlds could augment, expanding the Mandalorians' industrial capacity as they expanded across the galaxy. Key to this was the introduction of warforges, modular industrial plants that could be rapidly deployed onto conquered worlds and manned by slaves from defeated populations who would be put to work extracting a planet's natural resources and turning them into weapons, armor, vehicles, and even capital ships. As time went on, especially as the Neo-Crusaders began expanding the borders of Mandalorian space, the Mandalorians developed an efficient, if brutal, system for integrating conquered worlds into their nascent empire. Once a planet fell to the Mandalorians, its people would be given a choice between armor and slavery, between joining the Mandalorians or toiling in the Warforges. The latter group was immediately put to work producing equipment for the war effort, working either in newly built Warforges or in local industrial facilities that had been retooled for the Mandalorians' purposes. Those who chose armor would be tested to ensure their capability as warriors, issued their equipment, and then given crash courses in Mando'a and Mandalorian culture by a rally master. Speaking of Mandalorian culture, the shift from the Crusader doctrine to the Neo-Crusader one, not to mention the shift from Taung-dominated clans to ideologically bound rather than blood relation bound clans, resulted in dramatic cultural changes. The process of transformation that had begun under Mandalore the Indomitable was completed in this time, as the Neo-Crusaders were mostly secular. Of all the religious beliefs the Mandalorians had originally maintained, only the concept of the Manda and the vague idea of war as a holy pursuit survived by this point. But this was only the beginning, as it turned out. The Mandalorian Crusaders had maintained a number of other Taung cultural traditions apart from their religious beliefs, many of which died out during the Neo-Crusader period or had to be adapted to survive. The Taung preference for melee combat and dislike of ranged weapons, for example, was quickly done away with, as the Taungs became a minority among the Mandalorians and blaster weaponry became standard issue. The Taungs' fluid tribal clan structures were largely abolished in favor of Neo-Crusader militarization, which enforced strict hierarchies on all aspects of Mandalorian society. Even the centerpiece of Mandalorian life during the Crusader era, the highly complex and unwritten system of honor codes, which dictated every aspect of a Mandalorian's life, had to be revised to survive. This was largely due to the speed at which the clans grew during the Neo-Crusader era. It simply wasn't efficient to spend years indoctrinating new recruits in every little tradition the Mandalorians had inherited from the Taungs. It was too complex, and its largely unwritten nature meant it was difficult for new recruits to keep track of it all. Thus, the Neo-Crusaders greatly simplified all the aspects of Mandalorian culture that were deemed important and discarded the rest, consigning it to history. This might sound like a desecration of Mandalorian culture, but even veteran Mandalorians mostly saw it as simple streamlining, a necessary process. As the Taungs stepped out of the spotlight and the Mandalorians transformed, it was only natural that they would take a scalpel to their culture, tightening up their identity and how they define themselves. In time, the simple cultural tenets taught by the Neo-Crusaders developed into long-running traditions of their own, ultimately forming a culture just as rich as the one that had come before, if more suited to its post-Taung inheritors. Through all of these changes, Mandalorian ideology and the basis of Mandalorian culture and identity remained the same. The core of what it meant to be Mandalorian was condensed into the Resol'nare, the 6 actions, a simple, easy to memorize creed. The tenets of the Resol'nare were to wear armor, to speak Mando'a, to raise one's children as Mandalorians, to defend one's family, to contribute to the welfare of the clan, and to obey the reigning Mandalore. Whether or not one followed these tenets was all that defined whether or not one was a Mandalorian. The Resol'nare was supplemented by the Canons of Honor, which dictated what was and wasn't considered honorable in Mandalorian society. The canons were more complex than the Resol'nare, but they were still easy enough for Mandalorian recruits to get the hang of, especially on Duxon, where honor dictated the pecking order among recruits and could be gained fairly easily by a skilled warrior through combat with beasts of the jungle or by battling other recruits in the battle circle. Most forms of honor dictated in the canons were earned in combat, but Mandalore ensured that there were other ways to earn honor as well. Warriors that were too old to fight could gain honor by serving in support roles, acting as quartermasters, freighter pilots, technicians, or in other such roles. Technicians and engineers were especially honored as the canons of honor taught that whenever a war machine was used in battle, part of the honor belonged to the technicians that made or maintained it. But there was more to Mandalorian culture than honor codes, the Resol'nare, and even the ideology they all embodied. After all these things were still derived from the beliefs and traditions of the Taungs, and even as the time of the Taungs came to an end, aspects of these traditions lived on. The Neo-Crusader period saw the ranks of the Mandalorians explode in diversity as billions of new recruits brought aspects of their own cultures with them into the ranks of the Mando'a. Some Mandalorians feared that the strength brought on by these recruits would come at the cost of Mandalorian culture, which would be lost as the Taungs died out. But this was not the case. The Neo-Crusaders' process of cultural indoctrination maintained the heart of Mandalorian culture, such that even thousands of years after their extinction, the Taung lived on through their Mandalorian heirs. The most important part of ensuring this was Mando'a, the Mandalorian language, which had evolved from the language of the Taungs during the Crusader period. Speaking Mando'a was one of the Resol'nare, partly because having a common language was essential for such a huge and diverse army, and partly because Mandalore believed that preserving the Mandalorian language would preserve at least some elements of Taung culture. He was ultimately correct. Mando'a remained a defining aspect of Mandalorian culture for thousands of years, and unusually enough, the language changed very little during that time. To quote from Mandalorian's Identity and Language, a text put out by the Galactic Institute of Anthropology, in 5 millennia, the Mandalorians fought with and against 1,000 armies on 1,000 worlds. They learned to speak as many languages and absorbed weapons, technology, and tactics from every war. And yet, despite the overwhelming influence of alien cultures and the absence of a true homeworld and even species, their own language not only survived, but changed little. Their way of life and their philosophy remained untouched, and their ideals and sense of family, of identity, of nation were only strengthened. The unusual resilience of Mando'a likely owed to its importance to Mandalorian culture, as well as its simplicity. Mando'a, much like Mandalorian culture itself, was simple, flexible, and very easy to learn. It had a number of unique aspects that weren't found in any other languages, baffling anthropologists. It was agglutinative and rarely borrowed words from other languages. Spelling and punctuation weren't set in stone and varied based on dialect and even personal preference. And the language had no grammatical cases and only 2 verb forms. All of these features made it very easy for the Neo-Crusaders to teach it to an ever-expanding horde of recruits. Mando'a preserved many aspects of older forms of Mandalorian culture in the forms of sayings or even the way certain words were constructed. Other aspects of Taung society and belief were preserved in song. You've almost certainly heard of a few of the more famous Mando'a songs before, particularly Voda An or Brothers All, which was later adopted to be the anthem of the Grand Army of the Republic. Other noteworthy Mandalorian songs include Gratua Kun, or Our Vengeance, a Mandalorian battle song, Kote Darasum, or Eternal Glory, another battle song, and Karta Tor, One Heart of Justice, a Mandalorian funeral hymn. But one that deserves special attention has a name you might remember, Da Werda Verda. This song actually has no relation to the epic poem of the same name, which we quoted part of earlier. Rather, this Da Werda Verda was a pre-battle chant. It's a stirring piece of music with a wild and tribal feel, and its lyrics, when translated, describe the Mandalorians as the rage of the warriors of the shadow, with the ash of the Taung beating within their hearts. The song is believed to date to the Neo-Crusader period, from the years when the Taungs were finding themselves increasingly outnumbered by legions of new recruits. In that context, the song can be seen as a passing of the torch from one generation to the next, a plea from the Taung not to be forgotten, and an assurance to their heirs that the Taung live on in them, if only as ash in their hearts. Sure enough, thousands of years later, the Mandalorians continued to honor their progenitors, and Da Werda Verda, the swan song of the Taung, was among the Mandalorian songs taught to the clones of the Grand Army of the Republic. A rise of the Neo-Crusaders not only saw dramatic transformations in Mandalorian culture, but also dramatic transformations in the Mandalorian arsenal and organizational structures. One of the most controversial changes was the adoption of unified armor standards that saw all Mandalorians issued identical sets of standard issue battle armor. A number of veteran Mandalorians hated this change, since Mandalorian armor had previously been unique to each wearer, a symbol of individuality. Neo-Crusader armor was the exact opposite, and it was supposed to be. Ostensibly, it was Cassius Fett's idea. He and Mandalore believed that the growing size and diversity of the Mandalorian army meant that ways of ensuring unity were essential. Enforcing the use of Mando'a was a part of this doctrine, but Neo-Crusader armor was as well. Cassius Fett believed that adopting uniform armor standards would make Mandalorian armies look and feel like cohesive units, making it easier for new recruits to assimilate. Additionally, Neo-Crusader armor was color-coded based on rank, which made it easy for warriors to establish who's in charge in the chaos of battle. Mandalore agreed with Fett's position, despite his dislike for the appearance of Neo-Crusader armor, and with his blessing, Fett began enforcing the system. Not all Mandalorians wore the new armor. Mandalore himself didn't, nor did many of his top advisors, though Cassius Fett adopted it as a way of leading by example. Generally speaking, veterans of the Mandalorian Crusades were allowed to keep their old armor if they wanted to, while new Mandalorian recruits were issued Neo-Crusader armor. As the numbers of recruits quickly swelled beyond those of the veterans, this was a simple and effective way of ensuring the uniformity Mandalore and Fett wanted without alienating the old guard. There were a few variants of Neo-Crusader armor. Most of them simply meant to accommodate species with different anatomy than humans, but they all followed the same basic plan. The base of the armor was a reinforced vacuum-sealed combat suit which protected Mandalorians from temperature extremes, vacuum, environmental hazards, and electrical damage. It could be fully sealed in conjunction with a helmet and could be equipped with oxygen supply units with 10 hours worth of breathable air. Over this undersuit, Neo-Crusaders wore sets of heavy Beskar plates which weighed 42 kilograms altogether. Neo-Crusader armor featured much more Beskar plating than Crusader armor had, making it heavier and bulkier, but also much more protective. Of course, Neo-Crusader armor also came with a helmet, though the design of it was unconventional to say the least. The helmets of Neo-Crusader armor consisted of Beskar masks attached to flexible armor weave hoods, which incorporated strips of Beskar for protection. They had an odd teardrop shape and honestly looked a bit silly. However, appearances aside, Neo-Crusader helmets were effective at protecting the heads of their wearers, and unlike older generation Mandalorian helmets, they came with basic electronic heads-up displays, as well as life support systems and built-in comlinks. As we mentioned earlier, Neo-Crusader armor was color-coded based on rank. Recruits and rank-and-file warriors, which is to say the majority of Mandalorian Neo-Crusaders, wore blue armor. The next rank up, the Rally Masters, wore crimson armor, while the Field Marshals, the highest-ranking Mandalorians, wore golden armor. A select few special Mandalorians were issued suits of grey Neo-Crusader armor. Different variants of Neo-Crusader armor tailored to different species existed, incorporating modified helmets or simply removing armor plates that didn't fit. There was also an even heavier variant of Neo-Crusader armor that was issued to the Neo-Crusader Shock Troopers, a unit of elite Mandalorian warriors that answered solely to Cassius Fett. All variants of Neo-Crusader armor were compatible with a number of modifications. Common additions included wrist-mounted weapons, jetpacks, and stealth field generators, state-of-the-art devices that used holographic blending fields to render the wearer invisible to the naked eye and muffle sounds made by them. Stealth field generators were a favorite of Mandalorian scouts, and they were typically worn as belts. During the later stages of the Mandalorian Wars, Mandalorian Neo-Crusaders also made extensive use of personal energy shields. These were armbands that projected full-body energy cocoons, capable of protecting the user from certain kinds of damage for a short time. Most energy shields were designed to protect against blaster fire and lightsabers, but were able to be bypassed by vibroblades and other melee weapons. Mandalorian shields, however, worked the other way around. There were two kinds of Mandalorian shield: the Mandalorian melee shield and the Mandalorian power shield. The melee shield protected the user against melee attacks, absorbing kinetic energy and blunt force. However, it was useless against blaster fire and other energy-based attacks. This wasn't a problem for Mandalorians, as their Beskar armor was sufficient to protect them from such things. For added protection, however, elite Mandalorians were given Mandalorian power shields, which could absorb blaster fire as well. Both varieties of shields were expensive to produce and thus only issued to elite troopers. It wasn't until after the Mandalorian Wars that energy shields started to be produced in sufficient quantities to turn the tide of battles. The rise of Neo-Crusaders also saw the adoption of many new Mandalorian weapons, especially different varieties of blaster. During the Great Shadow Crusade, the Mandalorians had stolen a ton of advanced and experimental blaster weapons from Republic arsenals, and after the war, they adapted them to suit their own purposes, creating several varieties of cutting-edge energy weapons. These actually included some of the first modern blasters, which were superior to the pulse wave blasters that had predominated during the Great Shadow Crusade. In particular, the Mandalorian Neo-Crusaders favored a set of 6 ranged weapons to go with their existing arsenal of melee weapons, most of them varieties of blaster. The first was a basic blaster pistol that was issued to all Mandalorians, which was slightly more powerful than its Republic equivalent. There was also the more advanced Mandalorian heavy blaster pistol, which was larger and dramatically more powerful, one of the most destructive blaster weapons in the galaxy at the time. Most warriors were issued Mandalorian assault rifles, advanced blaster rifles that were both far more destructive and far more accurate than nearly any other on the market, making them almost comically overpowered. Mandalorians with special training in heavy weapons often chose to use the Mandalorian heavy repeating blaster, a bulky 6-barreled chain gun that could lay waste to entire squads in a matter of seconds. 2 other weapons were typically reserved for the use of Mandalorian officers. The first was the Mandalorian Ripper, an incredibly nasty weapon that defied classification. The Republic categorized them as disruptors, but they were actually slug throwers of a sort, firing solid slugs encased in cocoons of energy. These could bypass energy shields, though a lightsaber could still deflect them, and they had a particularly gruesome effect on their targets, which gave the Mandalorian Ripper its name. There was also the Mandalorian Disintegrator, which did exactly what its name suggested. The Disintegrator was a proper disruptor pistol, by far the most powerful model in the galaxy at the time. This time also saw an overhaul of the Mandalorian war fleet. The Neo-Crusaders kept their Basilisk war droids, which continued to be their greatest weapons. Indeed, Basilisks saw even more use during the Mandalorian Wars than they had during the Great Shadow Crusade, and the Neo-Crusaders designed several new variants of the droids with enclosed cockpits, which functioned more like heavy starfighters than animal mounts. But the Mandalorian's fleet of Basilisks was supplemented by new models of starfighters and dropships, which were churned out in ever-increasing numbers by the Warforgers. The Neo-Crusaders' basic interceptor was the Devab class starfighter, a unique asymmetrical craft designed primarily for defending capital ships. These craft were often accompanied by larger Terok class gunships, which were used to insert small teams of Mandalorian warriors, while larger squads were instead carried into battle aboard Q carrier dropships. Large armies were deployed by Shadlar-type dropships, heavily armored insectoid craft that could carry 800 warriors into battle. The Mandalorians also had a fleet of dungeon ships that were used to transport prisoners. These new craft accompanied the Mandalorians' new fleet of capital ships, all of them heavily armored and state-of-the-art. This replaced the Mandalorian Crusaders' fleet of stolen Fennelar and Basiliskan warships, though they still incorporated design features from the earlier craft. The Neo-Crusaders made use of 3 classes of capital ship, all of them with very alien appearances. The smallest was the Jahavier class assault ship, a class of frigate based on the Basiliskan design. These 200-meter long ships were fast and heavy-hitting, meant to act as frontline skirmishers, always on the offensive. Like all Mandalorian capital ships, they were shielded and heavily armored, but despite this, they were also fast and maneuverable with a highly favorable thrust-to-mass ratio. The Jahavier lacked starfighter hangars, but could carry up to 500 warriors for boarding actions or planetside troop deployment. These ships were armed with medium dual turbolaser batteries, heavy ion cannon batteries, and a super heavy concussion missile battery capable of fielding up to 36 concussion missiles. The Kyra Mud type battleship was another ship based on a Basiliskan design, and it made up the core of the Mandalorian fleet. Similar in appearance to Basilisk war droids, a version of this ship had seen use during the Great Shadow Crusade, in which they had acted as carriers for Basilisk war droids. The Neo-Crusaders used a redesigned and more advanced class of the Kyra Mud, however, which was tougher and more heavily armed. These heavy cruisers primarily acted as carriers, with large hangars capable of carrying 3 Shadlar class troopships and 36 Davab class starfighters, as well as drop bays equipped to deploy dozens of Basilisk war droids and capacity for 2,000 warriors. The Kyra Mud wasn't lacking in weaponry either. Each battleship was armed with 5 medium dual turbolasers, 2 heavy concussion missile launchers capable of carrying up to 80 missiles, and 4 medium point defense ion cannons. But the crown jewel of the Mandalorian fleet was the Candosi type dreadnought, an enormous warship based on an old Fenelar design. These massive capital ships were some of the largest and toughest ships to see use during the old Sith Wars, and they acted as the flagships of the Mandalorian fleet, fearsome behemoths that destroyed all in their path. They were over 1.3 kilometers in length, required crews of 10,000 each, and could carry 30,000 Mandalorian warriors as passengers. The Candosi was slow but extremely tough, with dense armor and double-layered deflector shields. Its hangars could carry 8 Shadlar class troopships, 128 Davab class starfighters, and a ton of Basilisk war droids, and it was armed with 5 dual heavy turbolaser batteries, 2 super heavy missile batteries capable of carrying up to 120 missiles, 2 tractor beam batteries, 4 medium point defense ion cannon batteries, and 2 point defense triple laser cannon batteries. Its missile batteries could carry concussion missiles or high-yield thermonuclear missiles. Before long, the Mandalorians' new armies began a series of new campaigns beyond the borders of Mandalorian space, conquering new sectors in the regions beyond the Republic's northern fringe. The Republic was still reeling from the Great Sith War, and Republic sectors in the Outer Rim were left all but defenseless as a result, leaving the Mandalorians unchecked. They began amassing vast fleets at Breshig and Arda, and Neo-Crusader parties moved freely along the Outer Polemian, reaching and harassing the northern fringes of Hutt space. The Republic was fully aware of the growing threat, but it could do nothing about it, and the Senate didn't even want to consider dealing with the Mandalorians while they were exclusively attacking non-Republic worlds. The Mandalorians, of course, were only emboldened by the Republic's inaction. As the strength of the Neo-Crusader army grew and Mandalorian culture was transformed, many Mandalorians started to whisper that a time of prophecy was at hand. An old Mandalorian legend spoke of the Analar Akan, the Great Last Battle, a prophesized battle that would be greater than any other the Mandalorians had or would ever fight. As the armies of the Mandalorians grew stronger than any other, many started to believe that it was only a matter of time until this battle was fought. As if this prophecy wasn't enough, the Mandalorians were also being spurred on by outside influence. In 3978 BBY, Mandalore the Ultimate was approached by an emissary of the true Sith, who recruited the Mandalorians' help in finding a Sith tomb on the frozen planet Rekyad. In exchange for their help, the Sith emissary told Mandalore of a vision his master had had. A vision in which the Mandalorians toppled the Republic in a glorious final battle. Mandalore took this vision to represent the prophesized Annihilation, and with faith that his victory was inevitable, he began preparing his forces for a grand crusade against the Republic. The Mandalorian Wars, as they were known to history, began in 3976 BBY, 20 years after the end of the Great Sith War. But for many years, the Mandalorians continued to avoid Republic targets, instead biding their time and conquering a huge chunk of the Outer Rim instead, swelling their army to a truly enormous size. In the 20 years since the last war, the Mandalorians had expanded the borders of Mandalorian Space somewhat, pushing a little closer to Republic space in the west and advancing out to the Salen Corridor in the east. Over the course of the first decade of the Mandalorian Wars, they would push even further east, conquering a chunk of territory slightly larger than Hutt space. The war began with the Battle of Altair, in which a Mandalorian fleet led by Clan Ordo managed to crush an Altairi fleet 10 times their size after a 5-day battle. From Altair 3, they pushed far into the depths of the Outer Rim, filling in the swath of space between the northern borders of the Republic and the pockets of colonial space it maintained in the new territories. Most of the planets the Neo-Crusaders conquered were unaligned and were incorporated into the Mandalorian war machine, while a select few met with other, less desirable fates. A year into the conflict, in 3975 BBY, the Mandalorians attacked Cathar, which had allied with the Republic against the Mandalorian Crusaders during the Great Sith War. In retaliation, an army led by Cassius Fett exterminated 90% of the planet's population, nearly wiping out the Cathar species entirely. A few worlds on the Republic's frontier were given similar treatment, among them Quelli, Coruscant, and Azure. 10 years after the start of the Mandalorian Wars, Mandalorian Space stretched from Wayland to the end of the Plemian trade route, from Renvar to the Khans sector. Thousands of worlds had been conquered, and entire civilizations had been assimilated into the Mandalorians' new empire. The Mandalorians had amassed an army far larger than any they had ever commanded before, and by 3965 BBY, they were finally prepared to unleash it against the Republic. That year, Mandalorian forces began to advance toward Taurus, a city planet on the Outer Rim where a lot of Republic corporations had facilities. But then, something unimaginable happened. The Senate did something. It suddenly granted Taurus and its neighbors full Republic membership and dispatched a huge portion of the Republic Navy to protect them. In the words of Saul Karath, one of the fleet captains sent to participate in the security cordon, Mandalore spends years picking off unaligned rimworlds, the Senate sits. Mandalore gets too close to one full of Republic business interests, and the Senate throws at Republic membership and a security cordon so long it would take 5 fleets our size to crew it. The Republic established the Jebel Vanquo Tarnith line, an enormous security cordon that stretched between Taurus and Mandalorian space. At last, the Mandalorians could go no farther without engaging the Republic head-on. The Mandalorian advance halted. There were minor skirmishes in the territory between the line and Mandalorian space, but nothing major. For the next 8 months, the Mandalorian Wars ground to a stalemate. This chapter of the conflict was known to history as the False War, for though it seemed to the Republic that the Mandalorian advance had slowed, in reality, Mandalore was just biding his time. 8 months after the start of the False War, the Mandalorians made their first move, attacking and capturing Flashpoint, a research station on the Mandalorian Road. This battle was largely inconsequential, and it would be another 2.5 months before the Mandalorians struck again, this time attacking Surja on the Jebel Vanquo Tarnith line. The Mandalorians fought 5 battles with the Republic over Surja over the course of 3964 BBY. Each of them was inconclusive, but the Republic deemed them evidence that the Mandalorians lacked the strength to break the Republic's security cordon. This hypothesis was thoroughly rejected later that year, however, when a Mandalorian armada under Cassius Fett launched a massive all-out assault on Vanquo. Republic forces were entirely unprepared for the scale and ferocity of the attack, and the Mandalorians quickly gained ground. Alarmed, the Republic Navy dispatched reinforcements to Vanquo from other parts of the Taris security cordon, giving the Mandalorians an opening to attack Taris itself. This had been Mandalore's plan the whole time, and it worked perfectly. The Mandalorians pushed through holes in the security cordon to initiate a three-pronged assault on Taris, finally unleashing the vast armies they had been amassing for nearly 3 decades at this point. The Republic had seriously underestimated the size of the Mandalorians' army, and as the Taris siege began, the security cordon at the Jebel Vanquo Tarnith line splintered. Despite the best efforts of Captain Karath and the Republic Navy, Vanquo fell to the Mandalorians, as did Jebel and Tarnith. The Republic fleets assigned to the security cordon were overwhelmed and destroyed, greatly diminishing the strength of the Republic Navy. Those Republic forces that weren't pinned down at Taris fell back to Soreko in disarray, and this was only the beginning of the onslaught. The siege of Taris was only one part of a massive three-pronged attack on the Republic, and even as Cassius Fett's army committed to capturing the city planet, other Mandalorian fleets attacked the Taung cluster and the northern dependencies, annihilating Republic forces in 3 sectors at once. And at Duxon, the Mandalorian forces that had been rallying in secret on the Demon Moon attacked Onderon. This time, without Republic support, Isis, the capital city, fell in hours, and the Mandalorians avenged their loss at the end of the Great Shadow Crusade. In the Taris theater, Cassius Fett conquered the planet after a lengthy siege, killing Admiral Veltra of the Republic Navy and establishing a forward command center in the old Taris Jedi Tower. In the Taung cluster, Mandalorian fleets won major battles with Republic forces at Liana, Makamte, Jamanir, and Queremia, wresting the Taung from Republic control. In the northern dependencies, the Mandalorians took Zongorlu and Ithor, paving the way for an assault against Iridonia and the Republic's northern flank. The true Mandalorian Wars had begun. 3,963 BBY saw the Republic rapidly lose control of the situation. The Mandalorians had the advantage, and they made full use of it. In the north, they captured Ord Mantell and began a near genocidal campaign of conquest against the Zabrak colonies, which ended with the capture of Iridonia itself. In the Taung, the Mandalorians crushed Republic forces at Tula, Flawn, and Sy-Mirth, following which they began harassing the northern territories of Hutt Space, winning battles with Hutt-backed forces at Taskid, Denogra, and Bunta. And in the Taris theater, the Mandalorians' main armada pushed slowly but surely toward the Republic's heart. The Mandalorians captured Jebel, an icy planet near Taris, for use as a staging ground from which they attacked Soroko. There, Republic forces had entrenched themselves in the cities of the native Stereb, betting that the Mandalorians would restrain themselves for fear of destroying the cities and depriving themselves of the loot within. They bet wrong. When Mandalore the Ultimate saw what the Republic was doing, he ordered a full-scale nuclear bombardment of Soroko, turning the Stereb cities into glass craters and annihilating the Republic battle group in orbit. Following the Battle of Soroko, the Neo-Crusaders carried out brutal attacks on Wayland, Mercia, Thrustra, and Obra Sky. They devastated Nuain and advanced into the Inner Rim, crushing Republic forces at Dargari Minor before beginning a slow but steady advance toward the core. Around this time, the Republic won a lucky few victories. A counterattack at Iridonia succeeded in driving the Mandalorians out of Zabrak space, and the Mandalorians' northern offensive was further stunted by a successful Republic counterattack at Ithor. The Mandalorians' main thrust was stopped at Omanoth, and on Jebel, an army of Mandalorians meant for an assault on Alderaan was transformed into Rakghouls by the power of the Mer Talisman, forcing Cassius Fett to sterilize the planet to prevent an outbreak of the Rakghoul plague. But these setbacks were only temporary. The Mandalorians opened up yet another theater of war with an assault on RS-3, following which they captured Azure, Contrum, and Geyser before advancing into the Slice. This chapter of the war was called the Mandalorian Triumph, for it saw Republic forces completely crumble in the face of a relentless Mandalorian advance. Republic world after Republic world fell to the Mandalorians and was ravaged, and the Mandalorian Armada crept ever closer to the core worlds, the greatest prize of all. The Mandalorians took Nazri, Vena, Umbria, and Zeltros, pushing into the Inner Rim and then into the colonies. Mandalorian forces in Hutt space advanced into the Mid-Rim, conquering Charos IV, while the main thrust breached the borders of the colonies and conquered Comenor, Quelor, and finally Exodine on the border of the core worlds. The Republic fought back where it could, successfully defending Lantils and Randon from the invaders, but it wasn't enough. Finally, in 3962 BBY, the Mandalorians breached the boundaries of the core worlds. They carried out a devastating assault on Duro, laying waste to its surface and ravaging its orbital cities. From Duro, the Mandalorians planned to advance into the Arrowhead, the heart of the core, before taking Coruscant itself. The Republic was on the verge of collapse, helpless against the Mandalorian onslaught. Desperate, the Senate begged the Jedi Council for aid, but the Council refused to get involved, as the Order's numbers were still recovering from the Great Sith War. This displeased not only the Republic, but the Mandalorians as well. They had expected that the Jedi would send forth Master Kavar, their greatest Jedi Guardian, with an army to stop them. After all, they had invaded the Republic looking for Anilar Akan, their last great battle against all the might of the Republic and the Jedi Order. A victory over the Republic would be incomplete, they thought, if it wasn't a victory over the Jedi as well. But the Mandalorians needn't fret for long. Jedi was soon to join the fight. It's a story that you probably already know. Two young Jedi Knights named Revan and Malak disagreed with the Council's decision and rallied a group of like-minded Jedi to join the fight anyway. The Council initially tried to stop them, but they relented after the Revanchists presented evidence of the Mandalorians' genocide of the Cathar, reluctantly granting these Jedi Crusaders sanction. Then, in 3962 BBY, after the Mandalorians took Duro, Supreme Chancellor Tol Kressa named Revan and Malak the supreme commanders of the entire Republic military, while their followers were made generals. The Revanchists' involvement was official, and the tide of the war was about to turn. Revan's first action as Supreme Commander was the reconquest of Duro, for which he made use of New Republic Interdictor-class cruisers to prevent the Neo-Crusaders from escaping with hordes of stolen war material. The battle was a major Republic victory, the first of many Revan would deliver. For the next 2 years, he and his followers would carry out a grueling counteroffensive, driving the Mandalorians from conquered world after conquered world. This always came at a high cost, but this was something Revan could accept. He grew to match the Mandalorians for brutality, and his strategies could be as bloody as they were ingenious. Revan, Malak, and their followers weren't the only Jedi to join the fight. A select few, led by Dorjan Decase, actually joined the Mandalorians, becoming the Mandalorian Knights. They won victories for the Mandalorians at Essien, Halthor, and Fadercom before Dorjan Decase was captured at Dantooine, following which the movement splintered. Meanwhile, Revan and his followers steadily drove the Mandalorians back out of Republic space. By mid-3961 BBY, Revan's fleet began a counter-invasion of Mandalorian space, slowly driving the Mandalorians from the worlds they had conquered in their early campaigns. They retook Liana in the Tion cluster, Taris in the New Territories, and Vorjid in Mandalorian space, following which Revan began to steadily dismantle the war machine the Mandalorians had built rimward of Mandalore. At Altair III, Elam, and Stenos, Revan won crucial battles, inflicting severe casualties on Mandalorian forces and greatly hampering their industrial capacity. At Lukazek and Jagga's cluster, the Mandalorians struck back, winning battles of their own. The latter engagement marked the last known appearance of Cassius Fett, who wiped out a Republic fleet in the battle but seemingly disappeared sometime after it. From 3961 to 3960 BBY, one of the bloodiest battles of the Mandalorian Wars was fought, the Battle of Duxon. In this devastating engagement, Revan's forces attempted to capture the Mandalorians' forward headquarters, sending in a wave of battle droids to take out the Mandalorians' anti-air defenses, before landing a huge ground army. The first stage was only partially successful, and the rest of the Republic's ground forces suffered extraordinarily high casualties between the Mandalorians and the jungle beasts. The battle lasted for months as Republic forces carried out an intricate strategy of feints masterminded by Revan. For every Mandalorian who fell on Duxon, 10 Republic soldiers died, and even the Jedi suffered high casualties. But nonetheless, in the end, Revan came out on top. The Mandalorians hid as much equipment and supplies as they could in hidden weapon caches in case they were able to return and then abandon their headquarters, leaving Duxon behind and fleeing to the depths of the Outer Rim. After Duxon, both the Mandalorians and the Republic had been driven to the breaking point. Republic military had suffered staggering casualties, while the Neo-Crusaders had been worn down as well, their once vast armies scattered and wanting for manpower. By 3960 BBY, both sides only had one major battle left in them. It was Revan who chose the location of this final battle, selecting a world deep within Mandalorian territory, a lonely planet called Malachor 5. Malachor 5 was a taboo world to the Mandalorians, but when Mandalore heard that Revan was rallying his fleet there, he committed all that remained of the Mandalorian armada to the assault. Revan, in turn, gathered the largest fleet he had left. The ships of the Republic fleet were all damaged and battle-worn, and the soldiers and Jedi aboard them were little better, but it was all the Republic had left. The main fleet, which was stationed above Malachor 5, was placed under the command of Jedi General Mitra Surik, whom Revan supplied with a super weapon to be used in case things went poorly: the Mass Shadow Generator, a device designed to weaponize artificial gravity and destroy the Mandalorian fleet. Revan and Malak, meanwhile, waited out system with a second smaller fleet waiting for the Mandalorians to arrive so they could catch them in a battle on two fronts. But things didn't go to plan. Mandalorian scout ships located Revan's fleet and attacked, pinning it down while Mandalore himself led the vanguard of the Neo-Crusader armada to Malachor. There, a furious battle began. As the two fleets tore into each other with the utmost ferocity, the Mandalorians knew that they had found what they had been looking for at last: Annihilation Akan, the great last battle. Both sides were fully committed. With Revan delayed, the Republic had no more reinforcements left to send, and in the words of Baldur, beyond Malachor, there were no more Mandalorians left to die. With Revan delayed, the Mandalorians had the advantage, and they pressed hard, destroying capital ship after capital ship, killing soldiers and Jedi by the thousands. Revan and his fleet eventually crushed the Mandalorian scouts and joined the battle, attacking the Mandalorian fleet from behind. While Malak led the fleet in tearing apart the Mandalorians' rearguard, Revan personally boarded the Mandalorian flagship, where he engaged Mandalore himself in single combat. The fight was fierce, but Revan won the day. Mandalore the Ultimate was slain by his hand. All the while, the Mandalorians continued to press down on Surik's fleet, which was nearing the breaking point. Left with no other choice, she gave the order to activate the Mass Shadow Generator and pulverize the Mandalorian fleet. But the device did far more than that. Gravitational anomalies in the Malachor system strengthened it, and it destroyed not just the Mandalorian fleet, but much of the Republic fleet as well. It also destroyed Malachor 5. The planet itself was ripped apart and forced back together around the superweapon, crushing Mandalorian and Republic warships into its crust, killing thousands upon thousands in a single instant. To those who felt the Force, the screams of the slain could be heard from across the galaxy. A few of the Republic and Mandalorian ships escaped being caught up in the gravity wells, as did all of Revan's fleet. When it was all over, the Mandalorians who remained transmitted an unconditional surrender. The Mandalorian wars were over, and the Republic had won. The Battle of Malachor 5 dealt the Mandalorians the most devastating blow they had ever suffered. The Mandalorian wars had burned away their entire army, destroying everything Mandalore the Ultimate had built. By Malachor 5, the Taungs were all but extinct, and humans became the dominant species of the Mandalorians, though non-human Mandalorians continued to exist. The Mandalorian fleet was destroyed, and after the Mandalorians' surrender, Revan had the Mandalorians stripped of their armor and weapons and forced them to dismantle their Basilisk war droids, effectively disarming the clans. But worst of all, after killing Mandalore the Ultimate, Revan took the Mask of Mandalore and hid it, preventing the rise of a new Mandalore. With no leader, what was left of the Mandalorian clans quickly turned against one another, wasting what remained of their strength in petty feuds and scattering across the galaxy. Revan had utterly destroyed the Mandalorians, and they would never fully recover. Some of those Mandalorians who remained returned to Mandalorian Space, now reduced to its original borders, where they feuded over succession. Many claimants to the title of Mandalore rose among them, but none amassed a significant following, and most were weak and killed within a few years. Many other Mandalorians were scattered all over the galaxy, becoming little better than thugs. Small bands of Mandalorians who had deserted before the Battle of Malachor V became roving bands of raiders, harassing Dantooine, Kashyyyk, and other remote planets. Other Mandalorians started a tradition that would define the Mandalorians for the rest of their history. They became mercenaries, selling their skills to the highest bidder. In the years that followed the Mandalorian Wars, a new war took hold of the galaxy. Revan and Malak became the new Dark Lords of the Sith, building a new Sith Empire that waged war on the Republic. The clans themselves continued their petty squabbles in Mandalorian Space, fading ever further into insignificance, while many Mandalorians fought on one side or the other. One became particularly prominent, Canderous Ordo, a Mandalorian mercenary who ended up working with Revan himself, who was redeemed midway through the war. Revan and his allies, including Canderous, helped the Republic defeat Darth Malak and destroy the Sith's secret weapon, the Starforge, the heart of their war effort. Following this defeat, the Sith too were scattered. After the end of this war, known to the galaxy as the Jedi Civil War, and to the Mandalorians as the War of the Starforge, Revan led Canderous to where he had hidden Mandalore's mask. He allowed Canderous to claim the mask and become the new Mandalore. Canderous declared himself Mandalore the Preserver, and as Revan left for parts unknown to face the true Sith, the new Mandalore began the process of regathering the Mandalorian clans. He did so on the orders of Revan, who warned him that another war was coming, a war of belief that had been going on in the background for thousands of years, and that the Mandalorians would be necessary to defend the galaxy against it. Mandalore began by gathering his own clan, Clan Ordo, which he led to Duxon. There, they secretly reoccupied the old Mandalorian headquarters and reopened all the supply caches the Mandalorians had built in the jungle, recovering plenty of old Neo-Crusader equipment. A few years after Clan Ordo settled on Duxon, in 3951 BBY, they were encountered by Meetra Surik, now a Jedi exile, whom Mandalore decided to ally himself with. Surik helped Mandalore gather other Mandalorian clans from Nar Shaddaa and Dantooine, while Mandalore and his clan assisted Surik and her other allies in ending the Onderon Civil War and saving the Republic from Darth Nihilus in the Battle of Telos IV. Many of Mandalore's followers were taken aback by his willingness to work with the Jedi, but as he explained, he had good reason for doing so. Revan had revealed to him that, at Malachor, Mandalore the Ultimate had told him of how the true Sith had manipulated him into starting the war with the Republic. The Sith had used the Mandalorians as pawns to soften up the Republic. This revelation, together with the lessons learned from Mandalore the Indomitable's alliance with the Sith, led Mandalore to declare that the Mandalorians would never again ally with the Sith, and that whenever the Sith reared their heads again, the Mandalorians would stand against them, even if that meant allying with the Jedi. As Mandalore understood, if the Jedi Order were ever destroyed, the Sith would inevitably dominate the galaxy, and the Mandalorians would be eradicated or enslaved. Thus, despite the animosity many Mandalorians had for the Jedi, they proved willing to fight alongside them against the Sith. Mandalore the Preserver would spend his life trying to reunify the Mandalorian clans. He was able to gather many of them under his banner, but there were always some that refused to acknowledge him, and the Mandalorians ultimately had a much slower recovery than Mandalore would have liked. The Mandalorian clans didn't fully reunify for centuries, though in that time, Clan Ordo and its allies became a force to be reckoned with once more. 3 centuries after the end of the Mandalorian Wars, the true Sith began their long-planned assault on Republic space, and when they did, they once more attempted to recruit the Mandalorians to their cause. Most of the Mandalorian clans, heeding the teachings of Mandalore the Preserver, refused to work with the Sith, but there were a few exceptions. A number of Mandalorian mercenaries, among them Shae Vizsla, were hired by Sith lords. But over the course of the Great Galactic War, Sith agents worked out a way to gather more Mandalorians to their cause. Through manipulation of the Geonosis Arena system, they arranged for a new Mandalore loyal to them to rise to power. Mandalore the Lesser, as he was spitefully known by later generations, called the Mandalorians to war on the Sith's behalf. Many clans, including Ordo, refused this call and considered this Mandalore a pretender, but others joined the war on the side of the Sith at his behest. Following orders from Jamon Kars, these Mandalorians amassed a fleet of warships and established a blockade of the Hydian Way, cutting off Republic supply lines and severely hindering the Republic war effort. The Mandalorian blockade withstood several Republic assaults, but it was eventually broken by an alliance of smugglers working for the Republic. To save face, Mandalore the Lesser called a great hunt to boost morale among his followers, but the champion of the hunt ended up killing him and claiming the title of Mandalore for himself. Proclaiming himself Mandalore the Vindicated, this new Mandalore maintained his followers' alliance with the Sith, drawing on the Mandalorians' age-old grudge against the Jedi to build support. But increasingly, many clans rejected this approach. A group of them, led by Clan Kadera, carried out an uprising against Mandalore the Vindicated, though this was ultimately quashed. Even that didn't stop the objectors, however, who continued to follow the teachings of Mandalore the Preserver. Led by Clan Ordo, these Mandalorians fought with the Jedi and the Republic against the Sith. They started to gain more of an upper hand when Mandalore the Vindicated was killed fighting the Eternal Empire. Shae Vizsla became Mandalore next, declaring herself Mandalore the Avenger, and she pursued a policy of neutrality, allowing her warriors to fight for whichever side paid more, though she led the clans in siding on behalf of the Republic on several instances. Mandalore the Avenger faced many challenges from dissenting clans over the course of her reign, but she was ultimately able to stave off all threats to her power. Following the end of the Galactic Wars and the destruction of the true Sith, the Mandalorians continued as they had before the war. Many were mercenaries, if fairly honorable ones, who worked to support their clans. The Mandalorians continued their slow but steady recovery from Malachor V, and eventually, the clans were finally united under a single Mandalore once again. In time, most of them would heed the lessons of Mandalore the Preserver, and when the Sith made yet another return to the galaxy, they weren't so easily conned into supporting them. When the next generation of Sith, the new Sith, arose in 2000 BBY, the new Sith Wars began. This devastating conflict lasted for 1,000 years, and the Mandalorians fought in many battles over the course of it, but not on the side of the Sith. Rather, the Mandalorians were consistent allies of the Jedi and the Republic during the New Sith Wars, though their alliance wasn't free of charge. This began around 1750 BBY when the Jedi Master Murtagh offered the Mandalorians a fortune were they to follow him in a campaign against the latest Dark Lord of the New Sith, the Dark Underlord. These Mandalorians played a crucial role in the Republic victory in the Battle of Malrev IV, using Lagarto's battle dragons and powerful battle harnesses to great effect against the Sith armies. Murtagh eventually fell to the dark side and switched sides after this battle, but the Mandalorians remained loyal to the Jedi and the Republic, fighting alongside them in many battles over the century. Unfortunately for them, the Republic didn't fare well in the New Sith Wars. By 1100 BBY, after centuries of Republic defeat after Republic defeat, the galactic government had all but collapsed, resulting in a breakdown of communications and trade. Most of the galaxy was plunged into anarchy. Some Mandalorians took advantage of the chaos to turn on the Jedi. In one notable instance, Clan Vizsla attacked the Jedi Temple and made off with the Darksaber, a unique lightsaber that, in canon, was made by Tare Vizsla, the only known Mandalorian Jedi. For the most part though, Mandalorians suffered heavy losses in many of the Republic's defeats, and the Dark Age of the Republic was a dark age for the Mandalorians too. By the 1050s BBY, the Mandalorian clans had once more been scattered. Mercenary work and the tides of war had spread them all out over the galaxy. To make matters worse, Mandalorian Space was ravaged by an outbreak of the Kandorian Plague, further devastating the Mandalorians' numbers. In 1058 BBY, a Mandalorian mercenary named Aga Awad returned home to find that his whole family and most of his clan had been killed by the plague, and that things had gotten so bad that ships traveling between the Mandalorian worlds had to group up into caravans from protection from raiders and pirates from neighboring sectors. But Awad wasn't going to let this state of affairs stand. He laid claim to the ancient title of Mandalore, becoming Mandalore the Uniter, and he initiated the return, calling the scattered clans back to Mandalorian space to defend their ancestral homeworlds. Without him, the Mandalorians might not have survived the new Sith Wars. Instead, Mandalore the Uniter turned the second half of the Republic Dark Age into a new Golden Age for the Mandalorians. Over the course of decades, he was able to gather the scattered clans and bring them home to Mandalorian space. Mandalore the Uniter and his followers were ultimately not only able to drive off the raiders, but revitalize Mandalorian society entirely. Mandalorian space went from being a lawless waste to a beacon of civilization and security in the no man's land of the Rim. For a fee, they offered their services to neighboring sectors, providing protection from raiders and allowing their slice of the galaxy to rebuild. By the time the new Sith Wars came to an end and the Republic started to put itself back together, the Mandalorians had become a major power once more. As previous great Mandalores had, Mandalore the Uniter ushered in a series of reforms that would transform the Mandalorians forever. His most important priorities were the revitalization of Mandalorian culture, the strengthening of clan bonds, and bringing Mandalorians back home to Mandalorian space, all of which were successful initiatives. Under Mandalore the Uniter, what remained of the Mandalorians' nomadic ways came to an end, at least for a time. With that said, he kept the Mandalorian mercenary tradition alive, though he encouraged Mandalorians to hire themselves out as clans or use their profits to support fellow clan members. Mandalore the Uniter also revised the Mandalorians' battle doctrine, likely with lessons learned from his mercenary work and the Mandalorians' losses in the new Sith War. In his time, the Mandalorian standard battle doctrine was still based on the Neo-Crusader doctrine, which Mandalore believed had outlived its purpose. He ushered in the era of the Mandalorian super commandos, teaching that every Mandalorian warrior should be a one-man army, self-reliant and flexible. The new models of Mandalorian armor that emerged around this time, which bore the design you're almost definitely familiar with, emphasized this strategy. Super Commando armor was designed with maneuverability in mind and was highly customizable, meant to be equipped with all manner of hidden weapons and gadgets so that a Mandalorian would never truly be unarmed. Under Mandalore the United, jetpacks became standard issue for Mandalorians, an essential part of their standard kit. Mandalore's new super commandos were supplied by a number of new companies founded by the Mandalorian general Gustav Zenlav. The most famous of these was Mandal Motors, which mostly built starships, but there was also Mandal Hypernautics, which made war machines, and Mandal Tech, which made personal weaponry. These companies rearmed the Mandalorians with state-of-the-art tech, and they brought lots of credits into Mandalorian space. Thanks to Mandalore the United, Mandalorian space reached its peak in the centuries after the end of the new Sith Wars. The Mandalorians were more powerful than they had been since the early stages of the Mandalorian Wars, and thanks to Mandalore the Uniter's single-minded focus on the restoration of Mandalorian space, the Mandalorians' home sector went from being a base of operations for wandering armies to a true bastion of civilization. But the Mandalorians' golden age didn't last. At first, they were a great help in rebuilding the galaxy after the new Sith Wars, stabilizing the Outer Hydian region after decades of chaos. But even after the Republic rebuilt and began to enter its own golden age, the Mandalorians refused to join it, despite having been invited to do so. They maintained a fierce independence, and they pressured neighboring sectors to remain independent as well through extortive trade agreements and defense pacts, which were often backed by the implicit threat of force. They enforced taxes on ships traveling the Hydian Way, and as a non-member of the Republic, the Mandalorians refused to abide by the new restrictions the Ruusan reformations imposed on sector defense forces, instead building up massive fleets and armies that far exceeded what they needed for defense. A number of influential Mandalorians, clan leaders among them, feared that the Mandalorians were repeating the mistakes of Mandalore the Ultimate, and warned that confrontation with the Republic would lead to disaster. They called for the Mandalorians to cut the warmongering and join the Republic. Mandalorian Space was one of the galaxy's most powerful sectors after all, and the Mandalorians could be an influential force in the Senate. But these moderates were overruled by more aggressive factions within Mandalorian society, which claimed that if the Mandalorians weren't warriors, they weren't Mandalorians at all. To the alarm of the Republic, Mandalorian society instead underwent a rise in militancy. By the late 700s BBY, there were well-founded fears that another round of Mandalorian wars were on the horizon, and that the Mandalorians would soon go to war against the Republic. Terrified of this possibility, the Senate decided to strike first. So began the Mandalorian Excision of 738 BBY, known as Dralahan, the Annihilation to the Mandalorians. A task force of local planetary security forces, led by the Republic Judicial Forces and the Jedi Order, carried out a brief but extremely brutal assault on Mandalorian space aimed at disarming the Mandalorians entirely. The Mandalorian fleet was destroyed, its armies were crushed, and the Mandalorian worlds were subjected to devastating bombings. Parts of Mandalore, Ordo, Fenelar, Concord Dawn, and all of Kalevala were reduced to deserts of white sand by the bombing, and countless Mandalorians were killed. The Republic then installed a puppet government in Mandalorian space, which was eventually handed over to the New Mandalorians, a faction of radical pacifists that had emerged as a result of the Excision. The New Mandalorians called for the complete transformation of Mandalorian society, including a rejection of the Resol'nare and the warrior codes in favor of a pacifist society built on commerce instead of conflict. The New Mandalorians and their followers relocated to new domed cities built in the wastelands of Mandalore and the other Mandalorian worlds, the largest of which was Sundari, the Republic-recognized capital of Mandalore and the Mandalore sector. Not all Mandalorians were on board with such radical change, of course. Many stayed in the non-ravaged parts of the Mandalorian worlds, acknowledging Keldabe on Mandalore, which was still located in the lush, verdant region, as their capital. There, they continued to follow the old ways in defiance of the Republic and the new government in Sundari. Every clan was split between the two sides. But these old Mandalorians, as the New Mandalorians called them, decreased in number over time. Sundari had the full backing and economic of support of the Republic, and as a result, the New Mandalorians prospered and took control of Mandalorian space. The growing prosperity of the new Mandalorian settlements drew in many of the younger Mandalorians. Thus, the Faithless, as the new Mandalorians were bitterly called by the traditionalists, grew in number, while with each passing century, the numbers of the faithful declined. Some among the new Mandalorians called for a return to the old ways, but they were exiled to Concordia, where they were believed to have died out. Furthermore, even the faithful saw a pronounced drop in militancy. Even some Mandalorians who still wore armor and new Mandalorian fighting techniques lived mostly peaceful lives or worked as solo mercenaries. But despite this, the Mandalorian warrior tradition continued. A new line of Mandalores began, and alongside the few warriors that remained to them, they returned to the Mandalorians' old nomadic ways. But over the course of centuries after the Excision, the conduct of the Mandalorian faithful started to decline. No event underscored this more than the Mandalorian-Itholian War of 200 BBY, in which the Mandalorian faithful went to war with the Itholians over a distillery and ended up committing genocide again, wiping out the entire Itholian species over booze. The Mandalore responsible for this was killed in a retaliatory strike carried out by the Jedi and the rogue bounty hunter Dirge, but the depredations continued under a subsequent Mandalore the Destroyer, who laid waste to the planet Luon a few decades later. The growing thuggishness of clans alienated many of the faithful who chose to become solo mercenaries or return home to Mandalorian space, where they retired to simple lives on the farms of old Mandalorian territory. By the Republic's final century, there were few genuine Mandalorian warriors left, and soon even these few would be divided. In 60 BBY, a new Mandalore arose. His name was Jaster Mareel, and he was originally a journeyman protector, a lawman from Conquered Dawn. Mareel authored the Super Commando Codex, a revision of the ancient canons of honor that dictated honorable practice for Mandalorian warriors. Mareel taught that Mandalorians should act as disciplined, honorable mercenaries instead of as thugs, that Mandalorian warriors should act with more of a sense of morality, and that the Mandalorians should give up plotting to oust the new Mandalorians and stick to fighting for the highest bidder. Many Mandalorians accepted these reforms, but others considered them heresy. These objectors were led by a man named Tor Vizsla, a brutal man who believed that the Mandalorians should become Crusaders again, and that the honor of the Mandalorians could only be restored through the overthrow of the new Mandalorians and a war of revenge against the Republic. With the darksaber of his ancestors as his symbol, he proclaimed himself the true Mandalore, and many of the more violent Mandalorians flocked to his side. So began the Mandalorian Civil War, fought between Jaster Mareel's true Mandalorians and Tor Vizsla's Death Watch. But before we get into the story of the Mandalorian Civil War, we quickly need to revisit a topic we've mentioned many times already, the Mandalorian Clans. The clans were a part of Mandalorian society from the beginning, but since most of the information we have about them comes from the period of the Civil War, we've waited until now to discuss the clans in depth. The oldest of the clans that we know of originated during or shortly before the Neo-Crusader period, as none of the Taung clans survived the Mandalorian Wars. Many others were younger and emerged in the later millennia of Mandalorian history. The only known Taung clan was Clan Keldau, whose signal of the mythosaur skull ended up becoming the symbol of the Mandalorians as a whole. Clan Keldau went extinct long before the rise of the Empire, but they lived on through the continued use of their symbols. Most of the other clans were predominantly human. There are many minor Mandalorian clans that are known only by name or by their involvement in a few specific incidents. Most of these seem to have died out by the time of the Mandalorian Civil War. These included Clan Sornel, Clan Genis, Clan Locke, Clan Gendry, Clan Itera, Clan Haranjir, Clan Far, Clan Deshra, Clan Kaja, Clan Chorn, Clan Rodark, Clan Shale, Clan Sharat, Clan Lone, Clan Spar, and Clan Werda. Many of these clans survived the Mandalorian Wars, only to splinter and steadily fade from existence over the next few thousand years. A few lesser-known clans survived much longer, enduring even into the time of the Empire. Clan Jaban, Clan Carid, Clan Deta, Clan Bevin, Clan Varad, Clan Vevut, and Clan Boroya were among these. Clan Skarada was another small clan that managed to survive through the Clone Wars, after which its numbers swelled dramatically through the adoption of clone deserters. That leaves us with the major clans. These were all large clans with long histories, many of them tracing their ancestry back to renowned Mandalorian warriors of old. Each of these clans had different reputations, as they favoured different battle tactics and differed in how honourable they were. All had members in the New Mandalorian, True Mandalorian and Death Watch camps, but the overall membership of some leaned one way or the other. Some had reputations of brutal killers, often giving rise to notoriously aggressive members of the Death Watch. Among these were Clan Priests, Clan Gedik, Clan Vizsla, all of whom gave rise to noteworthy Death Watch members, Dread Priest, Lorca Gedik, and Tor and Pre Vizsla, respectively. Clan Vizsla in particular had a dark history. It was an old clan, likely dating back to the Mandalorian Wars, and during the Galactic Wars, it gave rise to Shae Vizsla, later Mandalore the Avenger, who, for a time, was an ally of the Sith. Clan Vizsla was also responsible for stealing the Darksaber from the Jedi Temple, which, according to legend, they used to dominate other clans, instituting a reign of terror. Other clans leaned more toward the noble side, at least for Mandalorians. Clan Kadera, which led a revolt against the Sith-aligned Mandalores of the Galactic Wars, was one of these. Clan Ordo was another, as were Ordo's sister clans, Clan Braylor and Clan Kelborn, each of them named for members of Clan Ordo that were among Mandalore the Preserver's top lieutenants. Clans Braylor and Kelborn became distinct from Clan Ordo by the time of the Galactic Wars, but the three clans remained close allies and among the more honourable Mandalorian clans. From the time of Mandalore the Preserver onwards, Clan Ordo consistently remained one of the most powerful clans, as well as one of the most feared. Still, other clans were fairly evenly divided. The ancient clans T'Nau and Awod were among these, as was Clan Kryze. Much of Clan Kryze joined the new Mandalorian faction. Indeed, Duchess Satine Kryze ruled in Sundari by the time of the Clone Wars. But others in the clan joined the Death Watch, among them Satine's sister, Bo-Katan. The last notable clan in this category was Clan Fett. This clan traced its roots back to Cassius Fett himself, but the clan declined greatly over the millennia, to the point where, by the time of the Mandalorian Wars, it only had one known representative among the faithful, a man by the name of Jango. The Mandalorian Civil War lasted for several chaotic decades, affecting both the new and old sides of Mandalorian society. The Death Watch fought against both the new Mandalorians and the true Mandalorians, but they initially prioritized targeting the true Mandalorians with the aim of uniting all the faithful under one banner. Early in the Civil War, in 58 BBY, the Death Watch attacked a farm on Concord Dawn, the home of a journeyman protector from Clan Fett who had been providing shelter to the true Mandalorians. The Death Watch tortured Fett in front of his young son before the true Mandalorians descended on the farm. In the ensuing firefight, Fett and his wife were killed, but Jasta Mareel was able to rescue their son, a boy named Jango, whom he adopted as his own. Jango fought with Mareel and the true Mandalorians for years, and in that time, they seemingly managed to defeat the Death Watch, wiping out many of Vizsla's followers. But the Death Watch struck back in 52 BBY, and with the help of a traitor by the name of Montrose, they were able to kill Jasta Mareel on Quarter 6. Jango Fett became the leader of the true Mandalorians after this. He and his followers fought on, and in a later battle, they dealt the Death Watch another devastating defeat. By 44 BBY, Tor Vizsla had taken refuge on the planet Galidron, where he made an alliance with the planet's governor. The true Mandalorians tracked Vizsla to Galidron, but when they arrived, the governor called for aid from the Jedi Order, claiming that the Mandalorians were slaughtering innocents and looting their homes. The Death Watch provided evidence of this, and a Jedi task force led by Master Dooku was sent in to stop the Mandalorians. In the ensuing Battle of Galidron, every last one of the true Mandalorians was killed except for Fett, who was captured over and handed to the governor as prisoner. They didn't go down without a fight, however. By the end of the battle, 11 Jedi lay dead, 6 of whom Fett killed with his bare hands. Nonetheless, with the true Mandalorians destroyed, the Death Watch considered that theatre of the Mandalorian Civil War won. The governor of Galidron stripped Jango Fett of his armor and sold him into slavery, and after rebuilding, the Death Watch turned their attention to the new Mandalorians, against whom they began a campaign of terrorism. But the true Mandalorians weren't completely extinct. A number of other Mandalorians still upheld their ways, even though the faction had been disbanded. Additionally, Fett eventually escaped slavery, stole his armor back from the governor of Galidron, and wreaked bloody havoc on the Death Watch. Fett slaughtered many of the Death Watch's leading members and even struck down Tor Vizsla, whom he beat to death after a lengthy fight. This crippled the Death Watch, which was forced to go into hiding by 34 BBY, bringing the Mandalorian Civil War to an end. Jango Fett, the last of the true Mandalorians, all but abandoned Mandalorian culture after this, choosing to live as a bounty hunter instead of trying to rebuild the true Mandalorians. In 32 BBY, he was recruited to be the prime template for a clone army being assembled on Kamino, and we all know where his story goes from there. In the wake of the Mandalorian Civil War, the task of rebuilding Mandalorian Space fell to the new Mandalorians, who eventually emerged stronger than ever before under the leadership of Duchess Satine Kryze. Command of Death Watch fell to Pre Vizsla, who took possession of the Darksaber and led his warriors into hiding on Concordia, where Vizsla posed as the new Mandalorian governor of the moon. There, in secret, they reopened the old Beskar mines and began a steady military build-up, waiting for their chance to strike back. Of those few old Mandalorians who remained, Jango Fett recruited 75 to join the Koival Dar group, a group of elite mercenaries who faked their death and moved to Kamino to to train clone commandos for the Grand Army of the Republic. On Kamino, some of the Khoi Valdar imbued many of the millions of Fett clones being grown by the Mandalorians with a sense of Mandalorian heritage, with Fett even teaching the clones some old Mandalorian war songs. Nonetheless, while the clones' Mandalorian heritage was evident, they weren't truly Mandalorians. Not yet, at any rate. Jango Fett remained the last of his kind. Fett ultimately didn't live to see his clones in action. Just before their debut at the First Battle of Geonosis, he was slain in battle by Jedi Master Mace Windu. In this, it's possible that Fett fulfilled the prophecy that Kreia spoke to Mitra Surik. They will die a death that will last millennia, until all that remains is their code, their history, and in the end, the shell of their armor upon a shell of a man, too easily slain by a Jedi. Perhaps Kreia was wrong, or else this prophecy spoke of a Mandalorian who came after Jango Fett. For the Mandalorians didn't die that day on Geonosis with the death of the last true Mandalorians. One of Fett's clones, an ARC trooper by the name of Spar, had inherited Jango Fett's memories through an error in the cloning process, and after deserting the Grand Army of the Republic, he headed to Mandalorian Space. There, he met two old Mandalorians, Fen Shaisa and Toby Dalla, with whom he founded the Mandalorian Protectors, a new true Mandalorian organization that pledged to restore the Mandalorians to their former glory. Fen Shaisa spread rumors that Spar was Fett's son and rightful heir, and Spar proclaimed himself Mandalore the Resurrector, gathering followers from all facets of Mandalorian culture. Meanwhile, while the Clone Wars consumed the galaxy, the new Mandalorians remained neutral, in keeping with their pacifist ideas. But as the galaxy descended into chaos, Pre Vizsla determined that the time had come for the Death Watch to make its move. With the backing of the CIS, the Death Watch began a campaign of terror against new Mandalorian society. Their plan, developed by Pre Vizsla and Count Dooku, was to cause the new Mandalorians to lose control of the situation, sparking a Republic invasion of Mandalore, which the Death Watch could use to radicalize the people to their side, leading an uprising against the Republic occupation and retaking the planet. This had the added bonus of serving as revenge against the Republic for the Mandalorian Excision. Vizsla's alliance with the CIS fell apart, but in 20 BBY he made a new alliance with the Zabrak brothers, Maul and Savage, who adopted Vizsla's old plan for use with an army of factions from the criminal underworld. The brothers and the Death Watch strong-armed the Black Sun, the Pike Syndicate, and the Hutt Cartel into allying with them, forming the Shadow Collective. The criminal elements of the Shadow Collective then carried out the planned invasion and destabilization of Mandalorian society, while the Death Watch fought back, playing the role of liberator. The plan worked. The new Mandalorians were overthrown, Pre Vizsla claimed the title of Mandalore, and the Death Watch took over Sundari. With its capital gone, the new Mandalorian movement disintegrated and Mandalorian space fell into chaos. Maul eventually killed Pre Vizsla and usurped control of Mandalore, but some elements of the Death Watch, led by Bo-Katan Kryze, opposed his rule, and they ultimately allied with the Republic against Maul and his followers. The Shadow Collective was fragmented not long afterwards by the CIS, and Maul's followers returned to Mandalore, where they fought with the Death Watch loyalists for control of former New Mandalorian society. This formed a power vacuum in Mandalorian space, however, as neither side was strong enough to control the sector. The Mandalorian Protectors stepped into this vacuum. Mandalore the Resurrector openly supported the CIS, who provided the Protectors with ships and legions of BL series battle droids. The Protectors took control of most of Mandalorian space and revitalized the old ways, rallying an army of Mandalorians which fought for the Separatist cause on the battlefield of the Clone Wars. The Mandalorian Protectors dealt Republic forces severe casualties during the last year of the Clone Wars, fighting in battles on Null, Zadja, New Holstis, New Bornalix, and even Kamino. The Protectors suffered casualties in all of these battles, but they proved very effective. Too effective for the liking of Darth Sidious, the Sith Lord who had orchestrated the Clone Wars. Sidious arranged for the Mandalorian Protectors to be ambushed by Republic forces in the Battle of Norval II, a disastrous engagement in which the Protectors were all but wiped out. Only Spar, Fen Shaisa, and Toby Dalla survived. Following this, Spar gave up the title of Mandalore and went into self-imposed exile. He was never quite the same after the battle, and the trauma he suffered from the loss of his followers compounded his existing mental instability, leading him to descend into clone madness. Shaisa and Dalla tried to keep the Mandalorian protectors alive, but without Spar's heritage behind them, they had little success. By the end of the Clone Wars, the protectors were a non-factor and Maul's Mandalorians were defeated by Republic forces. As the Republic became the Empire, what remained of the Death Watch came under the command of Lorca Gedik, whose alliance with the Empire had him poised to take control of the Mandalore sector. With the end of the Clone Wars, Mandalorian Space lay in ruins, and things seemed bleaker than ever for the Mandalorians as a people. But Mandalore would survive, and even under the iron-fisted rule of the Empire, the Mandalorians would rise again. But that's a story for another time. We've covered virtually the entirety of the Mandalorian's Republic-era lore today, and we dare say that's enough for one video. But what do you think? Was this not enough Mandalorian for you? Would you be interested in hearing the later chapters of Mandalorian society, or perhaps a deeper analysis of their philosophy? Let us know your thoughts in the comments section below. And as always guys, thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video.